Hello everyone, in today's video I will be narrating stories that I found off of Reddit. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you subscribe to my channel, like this video, and comment something down below. But without further ado,
let's get straight into these stories.
This happened a few years ago when I was road tripping with my best friend, Rachel. We were driving through a rural part of the state, mostly cornfields and tiny, run-down towns. It was late in the afternoon, and we still had hours to go before hitting the next motel on our route. Rachel was the one who spotted it, a carnival seemingly in the middle of nowhere. You know the type, faded tents, rusty Ferris wheel, peeling paint on the carousel horses. "Do you see that?" she asked, pointing out the passenger window. I slowed down to look. It didn't make sense. We hadn't passed any signs for a carnival, and this wasn't the kind of area you'd expect to find one. The theory was tucked back off the road, surrounded by overgrown grass. "Let's check it out," Rachel said, already unbuckling her seatbelt. I hesitated, but curiosity won out. We pulled onto the gravel path leading to the carnival. It looked like no one had been there in years, yet the lights on the rides flickered dimly, and faint music floated through the air, one of those tinny, old-timey carnival tunes. We got out of the car, and immediately something felt off. The air was too still. No birds, no bugs, not even a breeze rustling the grass. "Hello," Rachel called out. No answer. We wandered further in. The smell hit me first, like something rotting, faint but unmistakable. I grabbed Rachel's arm. "Maybe we shouldn't be here." She rolled her eyes. "Don't be such a wuss. It's just abandoned." Then we saw the ticket booth. A man was sitting inside, or at least, I think it was a man. His face was pale, almost chalk white, and he had this weird, too wide smile. He didn't say anything, just stared at us, his head cocked slightly to one side. "Huey ... look around," Rachel asked nervously. He didn't respond, just waved us in with a slow, deliberate motion of his hand. We walked deeper into the carnival, past the Ferris wheel and a row of game booths. There were prizes still hanging on the walls, stuffed animals covered in dust, their fur matted and gray. I swear I saw one of them blink. Rachel tugged me toward the carousel. "Let's take a picture," she said, pulling out her phone. As she raised it to snap a photo, the music stopped. The silence was deafening. "Okay, this is officially creepy," I whispered. Rachel nodded, lowering her phone. "Let's go." We turned to leave, and that's when we saw the figures emerging from the shadows, dozens of them, maybe more. They were tall and thin, their faces painted like clowns, but their eyes were completely black. "Rugged," I screamed, grabbing Rachel's hand. We sprinted back toward the car, but the path we'd come down was gone, replaced by a wall of carnival tents that hadn't been there before. The figures were closing in, moving in this jerky, unnatural way like puppets on strings. The smell of rot was overpowering now, and the flickering lights made it hard to see. Somehow, we found our way back to the car. I don't even remember how. I just remember slamming the doors, locking them, and peeling out of there as fast as the car would go. When we hit the main road, Rachel looked back. "It's gone," she whispered. I glanced in the rearview mirror. She was right. The carnival, the path, even the overgrown grass, all of it was gone. Just an empty field. We didn't talk about it again until we got home and looked at Rachel's phone. She hadn't taken any pictures, but there was a video, one neither of us remembered recording. It was just a few seconds long, shaky and blurry, but you could make out the Ferris wheel and the carousel ... and one of those clown-like figures standing impossibly close to the camera, its black eyes staring straight into the lens. I've always had a fascination with cemeteries. There's something peaceful about wandering among the headstones, reading the dates, imagining the lives of those long gone. It wasn't unusual for me to take a detour after work to visit old cemeteries in my area. One in particular, St. Marian's, was my favorite. It was secluded, overgrown in places, and so quiet that you could hear the faintest rustle of leaves. Last summer, I made it a habit to visit St. Marian's every Wednesday evening. The caretaker, a wiry old man named Joe, would often wave at me from the caretaker's shed. He had kind eyes and a grizzled beard, and he didn't seem to mind my presence. One evening, I arrived later than usual. The sun was already dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows over the graves. As I strolled among the headstones, I noticed something I hadn't before, a small, crooked mausoleum at the far edge of the property. It was partially hidden by a cluster of ancient trees, the stones so weathered it blended with the foliage. Curiosity got the better of me. I made my way over, the air growing noticeably colder as I approached. The mausoleum door was slightly ajar, and an unpleasant smell wafted out, a mix of damp earth and something metallic. "Hello," I called, thinking Joe might be nearby. No answer. Against my better judgment, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air was thick and heavy, and my flashlight illuminated the walls, which were lined with small niches. Some held urns, others were empty, though what caught my attention was a pile of personal belongings in the center of the room: watches, wallets, glasses. They looked recent, not the kind of items you'd expect to find in a centuries-old crypt. A chill ran down my spine, and I decided it was time to leave. As I turned to go, I heard a faint scraping sound behind me. My flashlight flickered, and for a moment, the beam landed on something in the corner, a figure hunched in the shadows. "Joe," I whispered, my voice trembling. The figure straightened slowly, too tall and too thin to be the friendly caretaker. Its face was obscured by darkness, but I could hear its labored breathing, ragged and wet. I backed toward the door, but before I could reach it, the figure lunged. I screamed and bolted outside, running as fast as I could toward the caretaker's shed. Joe was there, sitting calmly in his chair, as though nothing was wrong. I must have looked insane, waving my arms and shouting incoherently, "There's someone in the mausoleum." I finally managed to choke out. Joe's expression didn't change. He sighed, got up, and grabbed a large, rusted machete from the wall. "Guess they got out again," he muttered, more to himself than to me. Before I could ask what he meant, he started walking toward the mausoleum. He didn't ask me to follow, but something told me to get out of there while I could. I sprinted to my car and didn't look back. The next morning, I checked the local news. No reports of anything unusual at St. Marian's. No mention of Joe. When I drove by later that day, the cemetery looked normal, except the caretaker's shed was gone, as if it had never been there. I haven't been back since. And to whoever or whatever was in that mausoleum, let's not meet. Ever. This happened a couple of years ago, but I still get chills thinking about it. For context, I used to live in a small town where everything closed early, except for one 24-hour laundromat on the outskirts of town. It was a sketchy place, flickering fluorescent lights, outdated machines, and an eerie vibe that made it feel frozen in time. One night, I realized I was out of clean clothes and had to do laundry. It was almost midnight, but I figured the place would be empty, so I grabbed my basket and headed over. When I got there, the parking lot was empty except for a beat-up white van parked on the far end. I didn't think much of it at first. Inside, the place was dead silent except for the low hum of the machines and the occasional clink of a coin dropping. I loaded my clothes, started the washer, and sat down in one of the plastic chairs by the folding tables. About 10 minutes in, I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. There was a door in the back labeled employees only. It creaked open slightly, and I swear I saw a hand, just a hand, retract into the darkness. My stomach dropped, but I convinced myself it was just my imagination. A few minutes later, I heard Fate whispering. It was soft and unintelligible, like multiple voices overlapping. It seemed to be coming from that back room. I glanced around, but I was still completely alone in the laundromat. Then the whispering stopped, and the silence felt heavier than before. I tried to focus on my phone, telling myself it was probably just pipes or the building settling. But then I noticed something even more unsettling. The white van outside was now parked closer, directly in front of the laundromat. My heart started racing. I thought about leaving, but my clothes were still in the washer. I told myself I was being paranoid and decided to wait it out. The final straw came when I glanced toward the employee's only door again. This time, it wasn't just slightly ajar, it was wide open, revealing nothing but blackness. I stared at it, frozen, until I saw something step out. It wasn't a person. I can't describe it well because my brain refuses to make sense of what I saw. It was tall, with limbs that were too long and bent at wrong angles. Its skin, or whatever covered it, was pale and glistening, like raw meat. It didn't have a face, just a smooth, blank surface where a head should have been. I bolted. I didn't even grab my clothes. As I ran to my car, I could hear the door to the laundromat creak open behind me, followed by the sound of something scraping against the tiled floor. When I got in my car and locked the doors, I looked back at the laundromat one last time. The thing was standing just inside the glass doors, motionless, watching me, if it could even see. I sped home and never went back to that laundromat again. A few weeks later, I overheard someone in town talking about it. Apparently, the place had been shut down because of some code violations. I didn't ask questions. I've always been a night owl, and during my college years, I used to love studying late at night in the university library. The place had extended hours during finals week, staying open until 3 a.m., and it was usually quiet, save for a few fellow procrastinators. The library was huge, with multiple floors and rows upon rows of shelves that seemed to go on forever. It wasn't uncommon for entire sections to feel completely deserted, especially late at night. That's where I made my first mistake, choosing the basement. The basement level of the library was always less crowded. It housed the older, less used books and a few study carols tucked between the stacks. It had an oppressive quietness, broken only by the occasional hum of the old fluorescent lights. But it was my favorite spot because I could study uninterrupted. One night, I was there around midnight, trying to cram for an exam. I'd been working for about an hour when I heard something strange, a faint whispering. It wasn't close. It sounded like it was coming from somewhere deep within the stacks. At first, I thought it was just another student talking to themselves or maybe on the phone. But the longer I listened, the stranger it became. The whispers weren't consistent. They would rise and fall, and sometimes it almost sounded like multiple voices overlapping. It was too far away for me to make out any words. I tried to brush it off, it kept working, but then I heard something that made me stop cold. My name. It was barely audible, but clear enough to send a chill down my spine. Jess, the voice whispered. It sounded closer now, like it was coming from just beyond the row of bookshelves behind me. My heart started racing. I told myself I was imagining things, maybe I was overtired, but then I heard it again, louder this time. Jess, come here. I froze. I didn't recognize the voice. It was soft, almost melodic, but there was something deeply unnatural about it. I gathered my things, trying to stay calm, and decided to leave. As I stepped into the main aisle to head for the stairs, the lights flickered. It was just for a second, but it was enough to make me stop in my tracks. When the lights steadied again, I could see something at the far end of the aisle. It was a figure standing perfectly still. I couldn't make out any details. It was too far away, but it looked wrong. Its posture was slightly off, too tall and rigid, like it didn't know how to stand naturally. It wasn't moving, just standing there at the edge of the shadows. I didn't wait to get a better look. I turned and ran for the stairs, my heart pounding. As I climbed the steps 2 at a time, I could hear the whispers again, but now they were louder, echoing all around me. When I reached the main floor, the whispers stopped. The library was completely silent, as if nothing had happened. I didn't stop until I was outside, standing under the safety of the streetlights. I never went back to the basement after that night. A few weeks later, I overheard one of the librarians talking about how the basement was rumored to be haunted. Apparently, years ago, a student had gone missing down there late at night, and they were never found. This happened about 3 years ago when I was a graduate student. My university had a massive library that was open 24/7 during exam season. Most people avoided the late night hours, but for me, it was perfect. Quiet, empty, and free of distractions, or so I thought. It was around 2 a.m. when I settled into a corner on the 3rd floor. The library's layout was kind of maze-like, with rows of shelves that stretched up to the ceiling and little nooks where you could sit undisturbed. I picked a spot near the back, surrounded by old books that probably hadn't been checked out in decades. I was working on a paper, headphones in, lost in concentration. About an hour passed before I noticed movement in my peripheral vision. I looked up and saw a man standing at the end of the aisle. He was just staring. He wasn't dressed like a student, no backpack, no books, just an oversized coat and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. I pulled out my headphones and gave him a nervous smile, hoping he'd move on. Instead, he turned and disappeared down another aisle. I told myself he was probably just wandering around, maybe a homeless guy looking for somewhere warm. The library was open to the public after all, but something about the way he'd been standing there sent a chill down my spine. I tried to focus on my work, but a few minutes later, I heard a faint tap 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 coming from behind me. I froze. The sound stopped. Slowly, I turned around, but the aisle was empty. That's when I started to feel uneasy. I packed up my things and decided to move to a more central area with better lighting. As I walked down the aisles, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see him again. I reached the main study area, which was better lit but still deserted. There were a few security cameras, which made me feel a bit safer. I picked a seat facing the entrance and settled back in. About 10 minutes later, I heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. This time, it was louder, more deliberate, like someone tapping their nails on a wooden surface. I scanned the room, but there was no one there. Then I saw it, a shadow flickering on the wall across from me. It moved, slow and deliberate, just out of sight. I grabbed my bag and stood up, my heart pounding. I was ready to bolt when I heard a whisper, low and raspy, like it was coming from right behind me. Why are you leaving? I didn't look back. I ran, full speed, all the way to the security desk near the entrance. The guard on duty was half asleep, but when I told him what happened, he immediately called for backup. They searched the library but didn't find anyone. No sign of the man, no tapping noises, nothing. The guard tried to reassure me, saying it was probably just a prank or someone trying to scare me. But here's the thing, when they checked the security footage, it showed me sitting alone the whole time. No man in a coat, no shadow, nothing. This happened about a year ago, and it still makes my skin crawl to think about it. I was living in a small town at the time, stayed in a rental house with no washer or dryer. That meant weekly trips to the laundromat. Normally, I went during the day, but that week had been hectic, and by the time I got around to it, it was nearly midnight. The laundromat was in a strip mall on the edge of town. Most of the other businesses were long closed, and the parking lot was practically empty except for a few cars. probably belonging to the other late-night laundromat users. The lights inside were harsh and fluorescent, buzzing faintly as I looked in my basket. There were only two other people there, a woman folding clothes in the corner and a guy sitting near the dryers, scrolling on his phone. I picked a washer toward the back and started loading my clothes. Something about the place felt, maybe it was just the emptiness or the way the buzzy lights flickered occasionally. As I was stuffing my clothes into the machine, I heard a strange sound, like a low, guttural laugh. It echoed faintly, but when I glanced around, neither of the other people seemed to notice. The woman kept folding, and the guy didn't even look up from his phone. I shook it off as my imagination and started the machine. I sat down on one of the hard plastic chairs and pulled out my phone, trying to kill time while the washer ran. A few minutes later, I noticed the woman had finished folding her clothes and left. The guy by the dryers was still there, but now he wasn't on his phone anymore. He was staring straight at me. I looked away, pretending not to notice, but I could feel his eyes on me. After a moment, I glanced back, and he quickly shifted his gaze like he'd been caught. I told myself he was probably just zoning out or something, but then I noticed something even stranger. The dryers behind him were running. Not one or two, every single one. I hadn't seen him load any clothes, and there was no way he could have filled all of them. The sound of the spinning drums filled the laundromat, and for some reason, it made my stomach twist. I decided to get up and check my washer, even though it still had a while to go. As I stood, the guy suddenly got up too. He didn't say anything, didn't grab anything, just walked toward the door. Relief washed over me as he stepped outside, but then I realized he hadn't actually left. He was standing just outside the glass door, staring in. The fluorescent lights cast his shadow long and distorted, making him look taller than he was. I froze, unsure of what to do. A loud bang jolted me out of my thoughts. It came from the back of the laundromat, near the row of washers. I spun around, and all the machines were off except mine. The doors on the others were swinging open and shut, slamming with no apparent cause. The fluorescent lights flickered violently. I turned back to the front, but the man was gone. The parking lot was empty. My heart was racing as I grabbed my wet clothes from the washer, stuffed them into my basket, and bolted for the door. I didn't care that they weren't dry, I just wanted to get out of there. As I was loading my car, I looked back at the laundromat. The lights inside were still flickering, and through the glass, I saw something that made my blood run cold. All the dryers had stopped spinning, except one. In its circular window, I saw a reflection of the man standing behind me. I didn't turn around. I slammed the car door shut and drove off, my wet clothes forgotten in the back seat. A few years ago, my small suburban neighborhood held an annual garage sale event. It was a big deal for the community, with every house dragging out their unwanted items to the curb for a weekend of bartering and socializing. I had just moved in, so I decided to participate, figuring it would be a good way to meet people. The morning was bright and cheerful, the kind of day that makes you feel safe in the middle of the most mundane activities. My folding table was stocked with old books, DVDs, and some knickknacks from my parents' attic. As I set up, a little girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, wandered up to my table. She was pale and thin, with long, stringy blonde hair that fell into her face. She wore a faded floral dress that looked like it belonged in another era. I smiled at her, but she didn't smile back. Her eyes, though, they were piercing. Not curious, like most kids, but cold and unblinking. "Do you have any dollhouses?" she asked. Her voice was soft, almost a whisper, and I had to lean forward to catch her words. "Sorry, no dollhouses here," I said with a shrug. She stood there for a moment, staring at me as if she didn't believe me. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away, disappearing down the street. I didn't think much of it, though I did glance around at my neighbors' tables to see if anyone else noticed her. No one seemed to. The day passed uneventfully until late afternoon when things began to wind down. Most of the other vendors were packing up, but I stayed out a bit longer, chatting with a neighbor. As we talked, I noticed the little girl again. She was standing at the end of my driveway, just watching me. This time, she wasn't alone. Beside her was an older man, tall and wiry, with deep-set eyes and a face so weathered it looked carved from wood. He was holding her hand, but it wasn't a comforting grip. It looked rigid, almost like he was holding her in place. His gaze locked onto mine, and a chill crept up my spine. "Is that your daughter?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. The man didn't answer. Instead, he tugged the girl's hand, leading her away. But as they walked past, she turned her head and whispered something I couldn't make out. It sounded like, "You'll see." That night, I couldn't shake the unease. I told myself it was just a weird encounter, but the girl's voice echoed in my mind. "You'll see." The next morning, I woke up early to clean up the remnants of the sale. When I stepped outside, I froze. Sitting in the middle of my driveway was a dollhouse. It wasn't mine. I had never seen it before. It was old and elaborate, with tiny, hand-carved furniture visible through the miniature windows. But it wasn't just the dollhouse that made my stomach drop. Inside, sitting at the miniature dining table, were tiny figures. They were dolls. They were crudely made figurines, carved from what looked like bone, and one of them looked exactly like me. I didn't touch it. Instead, I called the police, who came and examined the dollhouse. They seemed skeptical at first, but one of the officers noticed something that made his face go pale. Carved into the back of the house, almost imperceptible, were initials and a date. The initials matched mine, and the date was the same day I was born. I moved out of that neighborhood a month later. I still don't know who the girl or the man were, or how they knew anything about me. Let me preface this by saying I've never been someone who scares easily. I grew up in a small, safe town, and while I've read my fair share of creepy stories online, I've always chalked them up to overactive imaginations. But what happened to me last weekend has been replaying in my mind nonstop, and I feel like I need to share it. There's a local farmer's market that pops up every Saturday in the next town over. It's a charming little spot, homemade jams, fresh produce, handmade crafts, the kind of place where everyone seems to know each other. I've been meaning to check it out for months and finally decided to make the trip. It was a gorgeous day, sunny with just a slight breeze. The market was bustling but not overly crowded. I wandered through the stalls, sampling apple cider and admiring jars of honey. About halfway through, I noticed a stand I hadn't seen before. It was set up near the edge of the market, away from the main cluster of vendors. The table was covered in a dark red cloth, and various trinkets were arranged on it: old-fashioned keys, small glass bottles, and what looked like handcrafted dolls. The woman behind the table was, she looked to be in her 60s, with gray hair pulled back into a tight bun. Her clothes were slightly outdated, like something out of a black and white photograph. But it was her eyes that unsettled me. They were an unnatural shade of pale gray, almost white, like she was blind. But she wasn't. I could feel her gaze tracking me as I approached. "Something catch your eye?" she asked, her voice raspy but warm, like a grandmother telling bedtime stories. I hesitated but nodded, picking up one of the small glass bottles. It was filled with a thick, dark liquid that seemed to shift as I tilted it. There was no label. "What's this?" I asked. She smiled, revealing teeth that were far too white and perfect for her age. "A remedy for protection." "And protection from what?" I joked, trying to lighten the mood. Her smile widened, and for a moment, I swore her pupils contracted like a cat's. "The things you don't say." I laughed nervously and set the bottle back down, but she reached out and placed a cold, bony hand on mine. "No charge. Take it. Feel made it." Every instinct told me to walk away, but there was something in her expression, a mix of urgency and pity, that made me take the bottle. I mumbled a thank you and quickly moved on, trying to shake off the unease. The rest of the market felt different after that. I noticed small things. Stalls I'd already passed seemed to be in different places, and the cheerful chatter of the crowd sounded distorted, like I was hearing it underwater. I decided it was time to leave. As I walked back to my car, I realized the parking lot was almost empty. I could have sworn it was packed when I arrived. A sinking feeling settled in my stomach as I fumbled for my keys. That's when I saw her. The woman from the stall was standing at the edge of the lot, partially obscured by the shadow of a large oak tree. She wasn't alone. There were 3 figures with her, tall and motionless, their faces hidden by dark hoods. They didn't move, but I felt their attention, sharp and invasive, like needles pricking my skin. I jumped into my car and locked the doors, my heart pounding as I started the engine. When I looked back, they were gone. The lot was empty. The drive home was a blur. I felt like I was being followed, but every time I checked my mirrors, the road was clear. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the yard. I brought the bottle inside and placed it on the kitchen counter, intending to throw it away. But as soon as I let go of it, a sharp knock echoed through the house. It came from the back door. No one ever uses the back door. I froze, every hair on my body standing on end. The knock came again, louder this time. I grabbed a knife from the counter and crept toward the door. Through the window, I could see a figure standing just beyond the porch light. It was one of the hooded figures from the parking lot. I don't remember much after that. I must have blacked out, because the next thing I knew, it was morning. The back door was locked, and the bottle was gone. The only sign anything had happened was a single smudge on the glass of the back door, a handprint larger than any human hand I've ever seen. This happened 2 years ago, and I still get chills thinking about it. I was in college, a typical day of lectures and assignments, when I decided to grab lunch at the campus cafeteria. It wasn't my usual spot to eat. Usually, I'd take my food back to the dorm, but I had a gap between classes, and the cafeteria was quieter than usual. I grabbed a tray and scanned the room for an open table. Most of the ones near the windows were taken by cliques or groups studying together. Then I saw a nearly empty table near the back. A single guy sat there, hunched over a notebook, scribbling furiously. His hoodie was pulled up, and I couldn't see his face, but he seemed absorbed in whatever he was doing. I thought, perfect, he'll probably ignore me. So I sat down across from him, leaving a good amount of space between us. As I unwrapped my sandwich, I noticed something strange. He wasn't writing notes or doodly like I'd first thought. He was drawing faces, page after page, a sea of expressions, some twisted with anguish, others grinning in a way that made my stomach turn. I tried to focus on my food, but I couldn't help sneaking glances. His hand moved with unnatural speed, like he wasn't sketching so much as channeling something. I must have stared too long because suddenly he stopped. His pencil hovered mid-stroke, and without lifting his head, he turned the page, and there it was. It was May. My breath hitched. The sketch was unmistakably me, sitting at that table, holding my sandwich. Every detail, down to the pattern on my shirt. He hadn't even looked at me long enough to draw that. Before I could say anything, he finally looked up. His eyes were wrong, too wide, like he hadn't blinked in hours. His lips curled into a slow, deliberate smile, and he spoke in a voice that didn't match his face. It was too deep, too gravelly, like multiple voices layered together. "I've been waiting for you." I froze, sandwich halfway to my mouth, as his words echoed in my head. The cafeteria, though sparsely populated, suddenly felt suffocating. The chatter and clinking of plates seemed to fade, leaving only the sound of my heart pounding in my ears. I stammered, I think you've got the wrong person." He tilted his head, studying me like I was some kind of experiment. Slowly, he closed his notebook, the sound of the pages snapping together louder than it should have been. Then he slid the notebook toward me, his movements unnervingly deliberate. "I don't make mistakes," he said, his voice still carrying that unsettling depth. I didn't want to touch the notebook, but my hands moved on their own, trembling as I opened it. The sketch of me stared back, more detailed than before. My face wasn't just a sketch anymore, it looked lifelike, almost like a black and white photograph. But what made my blood run cold was the background. It wasn't the cafeteria, it was my dorm room. Every detail was there, my unmade bed, the poster on the wall, even the little stack of laundry I'd been putting off folding. My stomach churned, and how could he know? How could he have seen it? I glanced back at him, but he just sat there, grinning. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice barely above a whisper. "You already know." I didn't. At least, I didn't think I did. But something about him, it was like a memory just out of reach, like the sensation of trying to remember a nightmare after you wake up. I stood abruptly, the chair screeching against the tile floor. "Stay away from me," I said, my voice shaking as I grabbed my tray and started to back away. His grin widened. "You can't run from it. You know, it's already started." I turned and bolted, leaving my half-eaten sandwich and my tray on the counter as I rushed out of the cafeteria. My chest felt tight, and I could hardly breathe by the time I reached the safety of the crowded quad. I spent the rest of the day in a haze, trying to shake the feeling of his gaze burning into my back. When I finally returned to my dorm that evening, I hesitated at the door. My palms were sweaty, and every instinct screamed at me not to go inside, but I didn't have anywhere else to go. I unlocked the door and pushed it open, flipping on the light. At first, everything seemed normal. My bed was still unmade. My laundry still sat in a neat pile. The poster was still on the wall. I let out a shaky breath and stepped inside, closing the door behind me. That's when I noticed it. The notebook was sitting on my desk. I hadn't brought it with me. I left it in the cafeteria. My heart dropped as I slowly approached it, dread pooling in my stomach. It was open to a new page, and I didn't have to pick it up to see what was drawn there. It was me again, this time lying in my bed. My eyes were closed, and there was a dark figure standing over me, its face obscured by the shadows. Beneath the drawing, in jagged handwriting, were the words, "See you tonight." I've always loved Halloween. My neighborhood takes it seriously, with elaborate decorations, block parties, and hundreds of trick-or-treaters every year. But after what happened last year, I don't think I'll ever look at Halloween the same way again. It started off like any other October 31st. I decked out my house with fake cobwebs, a graveyard in the yard, and one of those animatronic skeletons that tells bad jokes. I was wearing a witch costume and handing out candy to kids. Everything was normal, festive, even until around 9 p.m. when the younger kids had mostly gone home. and the teenagers started roaming the streets. A group of 3 teenagers rang my doorbell. Their costumes were half-hearted. One was wearing a scream mask with a hoodie, another had vampire teeth, and the last just had a clown wig. I handed them candy, we exchanged the usual happy Halloween, and they wandered off down the street. Not 5 minutes later, the doorbell rang again. When I opened it, it was the same group of teenagers. Same costumes, same awkward stance. I laughed, thinking they were trying to double dip. Nice try, guys, I said. The one in the scream mask tilted his head slightly, like he didn't understand what I meant. Then, without a word, they turned and walked away. I chalked it up to them just being weird and shut the door. But then they came back, and again, and again. It didn't matter that I didn't open the door every time. They rang the bell over and over. Sometimes they'd knock instead, or tap lightly on the window. Always the same group, always silent. I texted my neighbor, Sarah, to ask if she'd seen them. She hadn't, but said she'd keep an eye out. Around 10 p.m., I'd had enough. I decided to turn off the lights and call it a night, hoping they'd move on. As I was locking the front door, there was another knock, louder this time. Angry, I flung the door open, ready to tell them off. But it wasn't the 3 teenagers anymore. It was just one, the scream mask. Except now, he wasn't wearing a hoodie, he was shirtless, his chest smeared with something dark. It looked like paint, but it smelled metallic, like blood. He stood there, motionless. I slammed the door and locked it, my hands shaking. I went to the back of the house to grab my phone and call the police. Before I could dial, I heard something tap against the sliding glass door. The scream mask kid was standing there, too. Except, no, that wasn't possible. He couldn't be in 2 places at once. My stomach dropped as I realized there wasn't just one scream mask. There'd be more, 4, 5, maybe more, all identical, all staring into the windows. I called 911, barely able to get the words out. The operator stayed on the line with me, assuring me help was on the way. I hid in the bathroom, trying to keep my breathing quiet. When the police arrived, the figures were gone. No sign of them, no muddy footprints, no candy wrappers dropped in the yard, nothing. The officers patrolled the neighborhood but didn't find anything suspicious. The next day, I asked around. None of my neighbors had seen them. Sarah swore no one had come to her house after 8:30. It was like they targeted me specifically. I thought maybe it was just a cruel prank, but then I checked my security camera footage. The footage showed me opening the door to no one at 9 p.m. and at 10 p.m. The scream mask wasn't shirtless, it wasn't there at all. After that Halloween night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I'd catch myself glancing over my shoulder whenever I left the house, scanning the street for those masks or anything that seemed out of place. For weeks, nothing happened, and I started convincing myself that it really had been some weird prank. Maybe my mind had played tricks on me in the chaos. That was, until the package arrived on my doorstep. It was early December, a few weeks before Christmas. There was no return address, and the handwriting on the label was jagged, almost childlike. I hesitated, but eventually brought it inside and opened it. Inside the box was a scream mask, the same one I'd seen that night. Its surface was scuffed and stained, like it had been dragged through dirt, or worse. Underneath the mask was a folded piece of paper. The note said, in the same shaky handwriting, "This us." I dropped the box and immediately called the police. They came, took the box and the note as evidence, and promised to investigate. The officer who came to my house, a tall guy named Officer Ramos, tried to reassure me, saying it was probably just a prank or some misguided attempt to scare me, but his tone didn't match his words. He looked worried. That night, I barely slept. Every creak, every gust of wind outside made my heart race. Around 2 a.m., I finally dozed off, only to be jolted awake by a loud thud on my front porch. I stayed frozen in bed, listening. Another thud, and another. Then the sound of something being dragged across the porch, slow and deliberate. I mustered up the courage to peek out of the window from my bedroom. The street was empty, but my porch was not. There were pumpkins, dozens of them, smashed to pieces, their guts spread across the porch and spilling onto the steps. In the middle of the mess was one intact pumpkin. It had been carved with a single word, soon. I didn't bother looking around for anyone this time. I called the police again. When they arrived, they found nothing, no footprints, no signs of anyone nearby, just the pumpkins. For the next few weeks, I barely left my house. I took time off work, had groceries delivered, and made excuses for why I couldn't meet up with friends. I even installed a second set of locks and motion sensor lights around my property. The nightmares started soon after. In them, I'd open my door to find dozens of scream masks staring at me, or I'd wake up to see one standing at the foot of my bed. Sometimes, I'd hear tapping on my windows, only to realize I was dreaming when I sat bolt upright, drenched in sweat. Then, on New Year's Eve, I received another package. This time, I didn't open it. I called the police immediately, and they came to take it away. They said they'd contact me when they had more information, but I never heard back. The worst part, the harassment didn't stop with the packages. Every so often, I'd find things in my yard, a single shoe, a pile of candy wrappers, or once, a broken cell phone that didn't belong to me. Each time, it felt like a message. message. A reminder, I don't know who they were or why they chose me. Maybe it was random, or maybe I did something that caught their attention. I've since moved to a new town, far away from that neighborhood, and changed my phone number and even my name on social media. This happened about 3 years ago, but I still get chills thinking about it. I was 19 at the time and had just started volunteering at a small community center in my town. It wasn't anything fancy, just a place where people could take free classes, use the computer lab, or pick up donated items like clothes and food. I signed up to help out with an after-hours charity auction they were hosting one Friday night. The event ended around 9 p.m. and most of the guests had left by 9:30. My job was to help clean up the multipurpose room, which was on the first floor near the entrance. There were maybe 5 of us left: me, another volunteer named Sarah, 2 staff members, and an older man who had volunteered to help set up earlier but stayed late to assist with teardown. I hadn't seen him much during the event itself. He seemed nice enough, quiet and polite, probably in his late 50 seconds or early 60 seconds, with neatly combed gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses. He told us his name was Mr. Connors. I figured he was just one of those retirees who liked to stay busy. By 10 p.m., we had most of the cleanup done, and the staff members went upstairs to lock up the office. Sarah and I were left in the multipurpose room, folding up the last of the chairs. Mr. Connors was still there too, wiping down the tables. I glanced at him and noticed something strange. He was moving slowly, almost robotically, and staring at the same spot on the table as he wiped it over and over. I tried to brush it off as I'm being tired. Around 10:15, Sarah said goodnight and left. I was supposed to stick around until the staff came back downstairs, so I stayed behind to double check the chairs and tables. That's when I noticed something else. Mr. Connors wasn't cleaning anymore. He was just standing there, perfectly still, in the middle of the room. His back was to me, and he was facing the far corner. "Mr. Connors," I called out. No response. "Hey, are you okay?" Still nothing. I started to feel uneasy. The overhead lights flickered slightly, which wasn't unusual for the old building, but in that moment, it made everything feel 10 times creepier. I decided to text one of the staff members to let them know something was off. While I was typing, I heard a noise, a low, wet, gurgling sound. My heart dropped. I looked up, and Mr. Connors was facing me now, but his face, it wasn't right. His mouth was stretched unnaturally wide, like he was trying to form words but couldn't. His eyes were glassy, unblinking, and somehow darker than before, like they were absorbing the light. "Are you lost?" he said suddenly. His voice was raspy, broken, like it didn't belong to him. "Do you need help finding your way?" I froze. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. He started walking toward me, each step deliberate and heavy. "Do you know where you are?" he asked again, his voice warpy with each word. I bolted. I didn't even grab my bag. I just ran out of the room, up the stairs, and straight to the office. I banged on the door until one of the staff opened it. I was crying, trying to explain what had happened, but when they went downstairs to check, Mr. Connors was gone. The multipurpose room was empty, and the main doors were locked from the inside. Here's the thing, when I described Mr. Connors to the staff, they told me there was no one by that name on the volunteer list. No one matching his description had signed in or been approved to help with the event. To this day, I have no idea who or what I encountered that night. After that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It started small, just an uneasy sense of someone standing behind me when I was brushing my teeth or sitting at my desk. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. After all, I hadn't actually been hurt. Maybe my brain was just playing tricks on me. But things got worse. About a week later, I was walking home from a friend's house around dusk. It was a clear evening, the kind where shadows stretched long and dark across the sidewalk. I was halfway down my street when I heard footsteps behind me, slow, deliberate, echoing mine. I turned around, expecting to see one of my neighbors. Instead, I saw him, Mr. Connors, or whatever he was. He was standing about 20 feet away, under a street light, perfectly still. His face was blank, his expression eerily calm, but his eyes, they were just as dark and empty as before. "Are you lost?" he asked again, his voice carrying down the quiet street like a whisper and a shout at the same time. My stomach turned. I didn't say anything. I just turned and started walking faster. The footsteps followed, not rushing, not running, just that same slow, deliberate pace. I broke into a sprint, my heart hammering in my chest, but the footsteps never sped up. Somehow, they still sounded close, too close. I made it to my house, slammed the door shut, and locked it. I stood there, panting, listening. Nothing. No footsteps, no knock, no sound at all. I peeked through the peephole. The street was empty. For the next few nights, I barely slept. I kept checking my windows and doors, making sure everything was locked. My rational brain tried to tell me it was just paranoia, but deep down, I knew it wasn't over. Then, 3 days days later, I found a piece of paper slipped under my door. It was folded in half, with my name written on the front in neat, looping handwriting. I unfolded it, my hands trembling. The note was simple, just 4 words, "Do you know yet?" I don't know how to explain it, but I felt like the words were sinking into my skin, crawling under it. I tore the note into tiny pieces and flushed it down the toilet, hoping that would be the end of it. It wasn't. Over the next few weeks, more strange things happened. My phone would buzz in the middle of the night, but when I checked, there was no notification. Lights in my house would flicker, even though the wiring had always been fine. Once, I woke up to find my front door standing wide open, even though I knew I had locked it before bed. And then there were the whispers. Late at night, just as I was falling asleep, I'd hear them. Faint, unintelligible murmurs coming from the corners of my room or the hallway outside my door. I never understood what they were saying, but they always left me with the same sickening question: "Do you know yet?" I don't know what I'm supposed to know. I don't know why this is happening to me. I moved to a new apartment, changed my phone number, and even stopped using my real name online. It helped for a while. Months went by with no incidents, and I started to believe maybe I'd escaped him. Until last night, I was coming home late from work, walking up the path to my building when I saw it. A single piece of paper pinned to my door. No note this time, just a rough sketch of a dark, empty room. In the corner of the drawing, barely visible, was a figure, a tall, thin man with glasses, standing perfectly still. I don't know how he found me. I don't know what he wants. All I know is, I don't think I can outrun him anymore. If you ever meet someone who seems just a little too quiet, a little too off, trust your instincts. And if they ever ask, "Do you know yet?" don't answer. This happened about 10 years ago, but I still get goosebumps thinking about it. I was 17 at the time, and my friends and I were the kind of teenagers who loved to explore creepy places just for the adrenaline rush. It wasn't the smartest hobby, but we were young and thought we were invincible. There was an old amusement park about an hour outside of town that had been shut down for decades. The story was that it closed after a string of freak accidents, fires, ride malfunctions, that kind of thing. It was boarded up and fenced off, but people in our town loved to share ghost stories about it. Naturally, we decided we had to check it out. One Saturday night, 4 of us, me, my best friend Kelly, and 2 other friends, Jake and Marcus, drove out there. We parked a little ways down the road and snuck through a gap in the fence. The place was even creepier than I'd imagined. Rusted rides loomed like skeletons in the dark, and the air smelled faintly of mildew and burnt wood. The only sounds were the occasional creak of metal in the wind and the crunch of gravel under our feet. We wandered around for a while, shining our flashlights on old ticket booths and faded signs. I remember laughing nervously, trying to act braver than I felt. Jake dared us to climb the rickety roller coaster tracks, but none of us were stupid enough to try. Instead, we made our way to the Ferris wheel, which was still mostly intact, though it leaned slightly to one side. As we got closer, I noticed something odd. One of the gondolas was gently swaying, even though there was no breeze. "It's probably just the wind," Kelly said, but she didn't sound convinced. Then we saw a man standing next to the Ferris wheel, partially hidden in the shadows. He was tall and thin, wearing a long coat and a wide-brimmed hat that cast his face in darkness. At first, I thought he might be a security guard, but something about him didn't seem right. He didn't move or say anything. He just stood there, watching us. "Hey," Jake called out, trying to sound tough. "We're just looking around. We'll leave if it's a problem." No response. The man didn't even flinch. Kelly grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "Let's just go," she whispered. But Jake and Marcus weren't ready to back down. "What's your problem, Dewey?" Marcus shouted, taking a step toward him. That's when the man finally moved. It was subtle at first, a tilt of his head, like he was sizing us up. Then he stepped out of the shadows, and my stomach dropped. This face, it wasn't right. His features were sharp and stretched, like his skin was too tight over his skull. His eyes were wide and glassy, reflecting the beam of Jake's flashlight in a way that made them look unnaturally bright. "Do you want a ride?" the man asked, his voice low and gravelly. He gestured to the Ferris wheel with one long, bony hand. None of us answered. We were frozen, staring at him. He tilted his head again, as if confused. "You came all this way," he said, a smile creeping across his face. "Why not stay for a while?" That was all it took. Kelly and I turned and bolted, dragging Jake and Marcus with us. We didn't stop running until we were back at the fence, scrambling through the gap and diving into the car. As we sped away, I looked back and saw him standing by the Ferris wheel again, his hand raised in a slow wave. We never went back, but a few weeks later, I heard a rumor that a couple of kids had been caught sneaking into the amusement park. One of them claimed they'd seen a man by the Ferris wheel who had offered them a ride. The other kid refused to talk about it, but he looked pale and shaken whenever the subject came up. For weeks after that night, I couldn't get the man's face out of my mind. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his stretched, unnatural smile and those glassy, glowing eyes. Kelly and I barely talked about it. She said she didn't want to give it power by thinking about it too much. Jake and Marcus laughed it off like it was some kind of prank, but I could tell they weren't as unaffected as they pretended to be. Something about that night had rattled all of us. Then the dreams started. At first, they were vague, just flashes of the amusement park, the rusted rides, and the swaying Ferris wheel. But they got worse. In one dream, I was standing at the base of the Ferris wheel, staring up at the gondolas. One of them creaked open, and I saw the man inside, his skeletal hand beckoning me to come closer. His voice echoed in my head, low and insistent, "Come take a ride." I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart racing. The dreams kept coming, more vivid each time. One night, I dreamt I was strapped into one of the gondolas, the wheel creaking and groaning as it turned. The man sat across from me, smiling that grotesque smile. As the gondola rose higher, I looked down and realized the ground was gone. Below me was nothing but a yawning, black void. When I told Kelly about the dreams, she went pale. I've been having them too, she admitted, but it might. He's not at the park anymore. He's in my house. That sent a chill down my spine. I tried to tell myself it was just our imaginations running wild, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. Something had followed us from that place. A few nights later, it escalated. I was lying in bed, unable to sleep, when I heard a faint creaking noise. It was rhythmic, like the sound of a swing moving back and forth. At first, I thought it was coming from outside, but when I sat up, I realized it was coming from inside the house. My blood turned to ice. I forced myself to get out of bed and follow the sound, even though every instinct screamed at me to stay put. The creaking led me to the living room. At first, everything seemed normal, just a dark, empty space lit only by the glow of a street lamp outside. But then I saw it. In the corner of the room, my rocking chair was moving, back and forth, slow and steady, as if someone invisible was sitting there. And then, just for a moment, I caught a glimpse of something, a tall, shadowy figure standing behind the chair, its face obscured but its presence unmistakable. I ran back to my room, slammed the door, and didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next day, I called Kelly and begged her to meet me. We needed to figure out what was going on. She agreed, but when I showed up at her house, she looked worse than I'd ever seen her, pale, exhausted, and jumpy. "It's getting worse," she whispered. "I keep seeing him in the mirrors. And last night, I swear I heard him outside my window." We decided to tell Jake and Marcus. If all of us were experiencing something, maybe we could piece together what was happening. But when we called them, neither of them picked up. We drove to Marcus's house first, and his mom told us he hadn't come home the night before. When we got to Jake's place, his car was in the driveway, but he didn't answer the door. Eventually, Kelly found a way in through the unlocked back door. I stayed in the living room while she called out for him. A moment later, I heard her scream. I ran upstairs and found her in Jake's bedroom. The walls were covered in frantic scribbles, written in what looked like black marker. Over and over, he'd written the same phrase, "Come take a ride." Jake was nowhere to be found. We never saw him or Marcus again. The police said they were probably just runaways, but I know better. Whatever we unleashed that night, it took the time, and now I think it's coming for us. Kelly and I don't talk anymore. She moved out of town a few months after everything happened. Last I heard, she was seeing a therapist, trying to cope with the nightmares that still haunted her. As for me, I've done everything I could to move on, but sometimes, late at night, I still hear the sound of creaky metal, and every now and then, I see a figure in the distance, a tall man in a wide-brimmed hat, watching me. If you ever hear about an abandoned place and think it would be fun to explore, don't. Some things should be left alone, and if you ever see a Ferris wheel swaying when there's no wind, for the love of God, don't go near it. I used to work at a small, historic theater in my town. It wasn't a glamorous job, just managing the ticket booth and occasionally handling concessions during intermissions. The place had been around since the 1920s, and while it had a certain charm, it was. Everyone who worked there had stories about the theater. Some people swore they'd hear whispers in the empty seats after a show, or see shadows moving in the aisles when the lights were dimmed. I'm not one for ghost stories, but after a few months of working there, even I started to feel uneasy. One night, I was scheduled to close the theater after a special late night screening. It was a classic horror movie marathon, which felt ironic considering how creepy the theater already was. By the time the last guests left, it was nearly 2 a.m. My coworker Mike, who was supposed to help me lock up, bailed earlier in the night, leaving me to close alone. The theater was eerily silent as I made my rounds. I locked the front doors, checked the bathrooms, and made sure all the projectors were off. Finally, I entered the main theater to turn off the lights. The room was massive, with rows upon rows of old, creaky seats and a faint smell of mildew lingering in the air. As I reached the light switch near the stage, I heard a noise behind me. It sounded like footsteps. I froze, my heart racing. Hello, I called out, my voice echoing in the empty room. No response. I brushed it off as my imagination. After all, I'd been hearing about this place being haunted for months, and it was easy to let your mind play tricks on you. I flipped the switch, plunging the theater into darkness. That's when I heard it again, soft, deliberate footsteps, but this time they were closer. I turned on my phone flashlight and swept it across the room. Nothing. The seats were empty and the aisles were clear. I told myself it was just the old building settling and hurried toward the exit. As I passed the concession stand on my way out, I glanced back into the theater lobby. That's when I saw her. A woman stood at the top of the staircase that led to the balcony seating. She was partially obscured by shadows, but I could make out her long, dark hair and pale skin. She wasn't moving, just standing there, watching me. "Ma'am, the theater is closed," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You'll have to leave." She didn't respond. She didn't move. Her head tilted slightly, as if she were studying me. I wasn't about to go up there alone, so I grabbed my phone and called the police, explaining that someone was still in the building after hours. They assured me someone would be there soon. I stayed near the front door, keeping an eye on the staircase. The woman didn't move. She didn't even flinch. When the police arrived, they searched the building from top to bottom. The balcony, the bathrooms, even the backstage area. They didn't find anyone. One of the officers suggested that maybe I had just been seeing things. Exhaustion, shadows playing tricks on my mind, that sort of thing. But I knew what I saw. That woman was real. I quit the theater a week later. Whatever or whomever she was, I don't ever want to see her again. After I quit the theater, I did my best to move on. There wasn't Ezzy. For weeks, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I turned a corner or walked into a dark room, I half expected to see her standing there. I told myself it was just lingering paranoia, but deep down, I wasn't so sure. About a month later, I bumped into Mike, the coworker who had bailed on me that night. We hadn't spoken since I left the theater, but I figured he might appreciate hearing my side of the story. Over coffee, I told him everything, the footsteps, the woman, how she just stood there like a statue. Mike's face went pale. He put down his cup and leaned in, lowering his voice. "Did she look wrong?" he asked. "What do you mean?" "Like, her face wasn't quite normal, too pale, her eyes too dark." His voice was shaking now. Chills ran down my spine. "Yeah, kind of," I said hesitantly. "Why?" Mike sighed and sat back, rubbing his hands over his face. I didn't want to say anything before, but I saw her too. About a year ago. My stomach dropped. "What?" "When?" "One night after closing. I was cleaning up the balcony seats after a show. Everyone else had already left, and I was the only one there, at least I thought I was. I saw her sitting in the back row. I figured she was a straggler who hadn't left yet, so I walked over to tell her we were closed. But when I got closer, she just disappeared. I stared at him, unable to speak. He continued, his voice barely above a whisper. I told the manager, but he brushed it off, said it was just my imagination. I didn't believe him. After that, I couldn't work alone at night anymore. Every time I was in the building by myself, I felt like she was there, watching me. Mike and I sat in silence for a while, both of us lost in our thoughts. Finally, I asked the question that had been nagging at me since that night. "Do you think she is a ghost?" Mike hesitated. "I don't know, but whatever she is, I don't think she's harmless." I didn't want to believe him, but I couldn't deny the sinking feeling in my gut. After that conversation, I started noticing things, small, unsettling coincidences that made me question whether I'd really left her behind. It started with the sound of footsteps in my apartment late at night. At first, I thought it was my upstairs neighbors, but the noises didn't match. They weren't muffled thumps. These were sharp, deliberate steps, like someone pacing back and forth. Then there were the whispers. I could never make out the words, but they sounded faintly familiar, like an echo of something I'd heard before. One night, I woke up to find my bedroom window wide open. I never opened it. The air outside was freezing, but the room felt stiflingly hot, like someone had been standing there, breathing heavily. The worst came a few weeks later. I was driving home from work late at night when I caught a glimpse of something in my rearview mirror. It was faint, but I swear I saw a figure sitting in the back seat. Long, dark hair, pale face, staring directly at me. I slammed on the brakes and whipped around, but the back seat was empty. My heart was pounding, and my hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. I drove straight home, locked every door and window, and sat in my living room with every light on until sunrise. I don't know what she wants, or why she's following me. I've tried everything to get rid of her, blessing my apartment, burning sage, even seeing a psychic. Nothing has worked. All I can do now is hope she'll lose interest and move on. But every night, as I lie in bed listening to the faint sound of footsteps in the hallway, I can't help but wonder, what if she never leaves? A few years ago, I worked as a security guard at a small, family-run amusement park in my hometown. The place had been a local treasure in the 90s, but had shut down a decade earlier when attendance plummeted. Rumors about accidents and mismanagement circulated, but I was never sure what really led to its closure. My job was simple: patrol the grounds during the overnight hours to deter vandals or trespassers. The park was eerie even during the day, with rusted rides and faded paint peeling from cartoonish mascots. At night, it was suffocatingly silent, save for the occasional creak of a decaying structure swaying in the wind. I usually kept to my little booth by the entrance, passing the time with podcasts and crossword puzzles. That night, however, a motion sensor near the old funhouse triggered an alert on my tablet. I sighed, grabbed my flashlight, and headed out to investigate. The funhouse was my least favorite part of the park. Its gaudy, smiling clown face at the entrance had decayed into something far more sinister over the years. One of its eyes had fallen off, leaving a gaping black hole, and the jagged teeth looked ready to snap shut. Still, I told myself it was probably just a raccoon or stray cat setting off the sensor. The air inside was stale, and my boots crunched on broken glass and debris. My flashlight cut through the darkness, highlighting distorted mirrors and faded murals of laughing children. As I made my way deeper into the funhouse, I heard something that made me freeze, faint, uneven footsteps echoing through the halls. Hello, I called out, trying to sound authoritative but failing to mask the tremor in my voice. This is private property. You need to live. The footsteps stopped. I waited, straining to hear any movement, but the silence pressed against my ears. I took a step forward, and the sound of my own footfall seemed deafening. Just as I was about to turn back, I caught a flicker of movement in one of the distorted mirrors to my left. It was faint, but I saw what looked like a figure, a person, and possibly thin and long-limbed, slipping around a corner. Heart pounding, I pointed my flashlight toward the mirror and then the hallway behind me, but no one was there. Swallowing my fear, I quickened my pace, determined to check the rest of the funhouse and get out as quickly as possible. I turned a corner into the room with the spinning tunnel, a disorienting cylinder painted in garish colors. The motor that used to rotate it had long since broken, but the platform still felt precarious underfoot. As I stepped inside, I heard a loud clang from behind me, like something heavy had dropped onto metal. Whipping around, I saw that the tunnel's entrance was blocked by the rusted clown head from the facade. I don't know how it got there. It was far too big for one person to move alone, but it sat there, its one remaining eye gleaming in the beam of my flashlight. Panic sudden, I turned to run through the other side of the tunnel, only to see someone, or something, standing at the exit. It was the figure I'd seen in the mirror, hunched unnaturally. Its head was tilted at an angle that shouldn't have been possible, and its face was obscured by shadows. It moved toward me in a jerky, unnatural way, as if it were being puppeteered by invisible strings. I don't remember much after that. I must have blacked out because the next thing I knew, it was morning, and I was lying on the pavement outside the funhouse. The park's owner found me when he arrived to relieve me from my shift. I quit that day and never looked back. A few months later, the park was demolished to make way for a shopping center. Part of me felt relieved, but the rest of me wondered what would happen to the thing that had made its home there. A few weeks after I quit, I started having dreams about the park. At first, they were just vivid memories, walking the grounds, hearing the hum of old rides, feeling the damp, sticky air of the funhouse. But as the dreams progressed, they became something else. In one, I was standing in front of the funhouse again, except the clown's face was pristine, its colors bright and new. The missing eye was back, but it wasn't painted, just a gaping void that seemed to draw me in. The figure was always there in these dreams, lurking at the edge of my vision. It didn't move, but I could feel it watching me. I'd wake up drenched in sweat. The image of its twisted posture burned into my mind. One night, the dream changed. Instead of the funhouse, I was in my own apartment. The air was heavy, oppressive, and I couldn't move. I heard the faint echo of footsteps, uneven and deliberate, coming from somewhere in my home. My bedroom door creaked open slowly, and I saw the figure standing there, its head tilted at that impossible angle. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. It just stood there, watching me until I jolted awake. After that night, I started noticing strange things around my apartment. Objects would be moved, small things, like a coffee cup I left on the counter being in the sink the next morning, or my keys turning up in places I hadn't left them. I chalked it up to stress at first, but the feeling of being watched never went away. One night, while I was watching TV, my motion sensor alarm app went off. The tablet I'd used for the job was still synced to the park system, even though it had been demolished months ago. My heart dropped as I stared at the alert, motion detected, funhouse. I dismissed it as a glitch. The system must have been picking up stray data from the nearby construction site, but the alerts kept coming, each one more specific than the last. Motion detected, tunnel. Motion detected, mirror hall. Motion detected, office. I turned the tablet off and shoved it in a drawer, trying to ignore the sinking feeling in my chest. That night, I dreamed again. This time, the figure wasn't in the funhouse or my apartment, it was in my living room. It stood by the window, motionless, staring out at the city. I woke up with a start. My breath cloth ragged, and instinctively turned toward my bedroom door. It was open. I distinctly remember closing it before going to bed. My stomach dropped as I reached for my phone to call someone, anyone, but before I could dial, I heard the sound of footsteps in the hallway outside my room. Slow, uneven, deliberate. Gripping my phone like a lifeline, I crept toward the door, heart pounding. The hallway was empty, but a chill ran down my spine as I noticed something on the floor, a single, dirty footprint leading away from my bedroom. It was larger than any human footprint I'd ever seen, and the shape was rugged. The toes were elongated, almost claw-like, and the arch seemed unnaturally high. I didn't sleep that night. I packed a bag and left for a motel, too scared to stay in my own home. Over the next few days, I stayed with friends, telling them I had a pest problem I needed to deal with. I couldn't bring myself to explain what was really happening. Who would believe me? The final straw came a week later. I'd gone back to my apartment during the day to grab a few things. As I walked into the living room, I froze. Sitting on my coffee table was an old, tattered flyer for the amusement park, dated the year it had closed. Scrawled across it in smeared black ink were the words, USHOULDN have left. I moved out that same day, breaking my lease and losing most of my deposit in the process. I didn't care. I just wanted to be as far away from that place as possible. It's been years now, and I've tried to put it all behind me. I live in a new city under a new name, and I've told myself it's over. But sometimes, late at night, I'll catch a faint whiff of stale air, or hear the faintest echo of uneven footsteps outside my window. When I was 17, I worked part-time at a mall at Pop Ice Cream Parlor in my hometown. It was an old-fashioned kind of place with checkered floors, shiny red stools, and a clunky cash register that dinged when you opened it. The job was quiet, especially on weekday evenings when the only customers were the occasional family or a couple of teenagers killing time. One Friday night, my manager asked me to close up alone for the first time. I wasn't thrilled about it, but I'd seen him do it a dozen times and figured I could handle it. Plus, the shop closed at 9 p.m., so it wasn't like I'd be there late. Around 8:45 p.m., the shop was completely empty, and I was wiping down the counters when the bell above the door jingled. I looked up to see a woman walk in. She was probably in her late 30 seconds, wearing a beige trench coat that looked too warm for the mild spring weather. Her hair was pulled back tightly, and she had this unsettling, wide smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Hi there," she said, her voice overly cheerful. "Still open?" I nodded. "Yeah, we're open for another 15 minutes. What can I get you?" She walked slowly past the counter, her eyes darting around the shop like she was searching for something. Finally, she settled on a small table near the back and sat down. "Actually, I'm not ready yet. Do you mind if I take a minute to decide?" Something about her made me uneasy, but I didn't want to be rude. "Sure, take your time," I said, then went back to cleaning. Minutes ticked by, and she didn't move. She didn't even look at the menu. She just sat there, her hands clasped tightly on the table, staring at me with that same unnerving smile. By 8:55, I decided to remind her we were closing soon. "Ma'am, we'll be closing in a few minutes. Can I get you anything?" Her smile faltered, and for a moment, I thought she was angry, but then she tilted her head and said, "Oh, I'm not really here for the ice cream." My stomach dropped. I tried to laugh it off. "Oh, then why are you here?" Her smile returned, wider this time. "I waited." The way she said it made my skin crawl. "Waiting for what?" "Not what," she replied, her tone sing-song. "Who?" Before I could respond, the bell above the door jingled again. A man walked in, tall and thin, wearing a dark hoodie with the hood pulled up. He didn't look at me. He didn't even glance at the woman. He just walked straight to the counter. "We're closing soon," I said, my voice shaking slightly. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, his face obscured by the shadow of his hood. Then, without warning, he reached over the counter and grabbed my wrist. "Hey, let go," I yelled, trying to pull away, but his grip was like iron. The woman's voice cut through the air. "Step." "Not yet." The man froze, still holding my wrist. The woman stood up and slowly walked over to us, her heels clicking on the tiled floor. She leaned in close, her face inches from mine. "You're not the one," she whispered. Then, to the man, she said, "Let her go." He released me immediately, and I stumbled back, clutching my wrist. The woman turned to him and nodded toward the door. "Let's go. We're done here." Without another word, they both walked out, the bell jingling softly as the door swung shut behind them. I locked the door the second they were gone and called my manager, barely able to get the words out as I explained what had just happened. The police came and took my statement, but there wasn't much they could do. The shop's security cameras were old and grainy, and they couldn't make out the faces of either the man or the woman. They told me it was probably just a couple of weirdos trying to scare me, but I wasn't so sure. A few weeks later, I was working an afternoon shift when a regular customer came in. Mrs. Patterson was an elderly woman who lived nearby and often came by for a single scoop of butter pecan. She'd always chat with me about her garden or her grandchildren, and it was a nice break from the monotony. That day, as I handed her the cone, she paused and looked at me closely. "You look tired, dear. Everything all right?" I hesitated, then decided to tell her a watered-down version of what what had happened that night. As I described the woman and her unsettling behavior, Mrs. Patterson's face grew pale. "Did you say a beige trench coat?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Yeah," I replied, confused. "Why?" She shook her head, her hand gripping the counter for support. "Years ago, there was a woman who used to wander this area wearing a trench coat just like that. People said she'd show up at random places, waiting for someone. There were rumors she was part of some cult, looking for new members. But one day, she just disappeared. No one ever saw her again." My blood ran cold. Mrs. Patterson must have noticed because she reached out and patted my hand. "It's probably just a coincidence, dear. Don't think too much about it." But I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't a coincidence. I started noticing little things: a car parked across the street for hours, strangers lingering near the shop longer than seemed normal. Nothing ever happened, but the unease never left me. I quit the job a few months later when I left for college. Years later, I returned to my hometown for the holidays. Walking down Main Street, I passed the old ice cream parlor, now shuttered and abandoned. The windows were dusty, the sign faded, but I couldn't help stopping to stare. Memories of that night rushed back, and a shiver ran down my spine. As I stood there, I felt a distinct sensation of being watched. Turning quickly, I scanned the street. It was mostly empty, save for a few passers-by. Then I saw it. Across the street, leaning against a lamppost, was a woman in a beige trench coat. Her hair was pulled back tightly, and though the distance made it hard to be sure, I could have sworn she was smiling. I didn't wait to confirm. I turned and walked away, my pace quickening with every step. Months after my visit, I received a package in the mail with no return address. Inside was a faded photograph of the ice cream parlor taken long before I worked there. Standing in front of it were two figures, a man in a dark hoodie and a woman in a beige trench coat. The photo looked old, decades old, but the faces were unmistakably theirs. I stared at the picture, my hands trembling. On the back, scrawled in messy handwriting, were the words, "We'll be waiting." I moved shortly after. And to them, wherever they are, I hope we never meet again. This happened a few years ago when I was living in a small, quiet town where nothing much ever happened. I didn't have a washer or dryer at home, so I'd go to this 24-hour laundromat a few blocks away. It was always a bit eerie at night, with its flickery fluorescent lights and the rhythmic hum of machines, but it was cheap and convenient, so I didn't mind. One Friday night, around 11 p.m., I decided to do my laundry. I figured the place would be empty and I'd have the machines to myself. When I got there, I was right. At first, I loaded my clothes into a machine in the corner and sat down to scroll through my phone while I waited. A few minutes in, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye, a woman standing by the door. She was just standing there, not moving, not holding any laundry, just staring inside. She didn't look homeless or anything, just normal, mid-30s, wearing jeans and a hoodie. Her face was blank, almost like she was in a trance. I tried to ignore her and went back to my phone, but every time I glanced up, she was still there, staring. I started to feel uneasy. Maybe she was waiting for someone, I thought, or maybe she was just deciding whether to come in. But after 10 minutes of this, it started to feel off. I looked at her directly, hoping she'd get the hint and either come in or leave, but her eyes locked onto mine. And then she smiled, not a friendly smile, not even a creepy one. It was like her face just twisted into this too wide grin, like she was forcing herself to look happy. Her teeth were perfectly straight, too perfect, almost unnatural. I felt a chill run down my spine. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She didn't answer. Instead, she opened the door and stepped inside, walking slowly toward me. She didn't blink, didn't stop smiling. She wasn't carrying anything, no laundry, no bag, nothing. Just walking straight toward me, her hands hanging loosely at her sides. I stood up, my heart racing. "Hey, seriously, do you need something?" She stopped about 10 feet away from me. The grin disappeared, and she tilted her head to one side, like she was studying me. Then she whispered, almost too quietly to hear, "You shouldn't be here." "What?" I asked, my voice shaking now. She didn't repeat herself. Instead, she turned sharply and walked toward the back of the laundromat, disappearing behind the rows of machines. I stood there, frozen, my mind racing. Should I leave? Call someone? But then I thought, what if she's messing with me? Maybe she was drunk or high. I decided to wait it out. I didn't hear any footsteps, no rustling, nothing. After a few minutes, I worked up the courage to peek around the machines to see where she went. She wasn't there. The back of the laundromat was a dead end, just a row of dryers and a small supply closet. There was no way she could have left without me hearing her. My heart felt like it was going to explode. I backed up toward the door, grabbed my still wet clothes from the washer, and bolted out of there. As I hurried down the street, I glanced back at the laundromat one last time. She was standing at the window, her face pressed against the glass, grinning that impossibly wide grin. I wish I could say that was the end of it, I mean, I tried to move on. I started going to a different laundromat a little farther away, even though it was more expensive. For a while, things were fine. A few weeks passed, and I convinced myself it had just been a strange, one-off encounter. Maybe she was some unhinged person, and I just happened to be the unlucky target of her weirdness. But then, little things started happening. The first time, it was subtle. I'd wake up in the middle of the night to the sound of a faint humming. At first, I thought it was my neighbor's TV or something, but it didn't quite sound right. It was rhythmic, almost mechanical, like the sound of a washing machine. I live alone, and I don't even have a washer, so it didn't make any sense. I'd sit up in bed, heart pounding, but the sound would always stop the moment I tried to pinpoint it. The next incident was harder to explain. I was folding laundry in my bedroom when I noticed a piece of clothing that didn't belong to me. It was a plain gray hoodie, similar to the one that woman had been wearing. I froze. I hadn't picked it up by accident. It definitely wasn't in the basket when I brought my laundry home from the new place. I grabbed it with shaking hands, tossed it into a garbage bag, and threw it into the dumpster outside. But that night, I heard the humming again, louder this time. The next morning, I found the hoodie folded neatly on my kitchen table. I completely lost it. I called a friend and begged him to come over. I didn't even know how to explain what was happening without sounding insane, but they came anyway. We searched my entire apartment together, every closet, every cupboard, even under the bed. Nothing, no signs of forced entry, no clues as to how the hoodie had ended up back in my apartment. After my friend left, I decided to get out of the house for a bit. I went for a drive, just to clear my head. I didn't have a destination in mind, but somehow I ended up near the old laundromat. I don't know why, I certainly hadn't meant to go there, but as I drove past, I saw her. She was standing outside, right where she'd been the first time, staring in through the glass door. Only this time, she wasn't smiling. Her face was blank, her eyes dark and hollow. She didn't look like the woman I'd seen before. Her skin was pale, almost gray, and her features seemed distorted, like they'd been stretched too far. I didn't stop. I didn't even slow down. I drove home as fast as I could, locked all my doors and windows, and sat in my living room with every light in the house on. That night, I had a dream, or at least I think it was a dream. I was back in the laundromat. It was empty, except for the hum of the machines. I looked around, and there she was, standing in the corner, her grin wider than ever. She didn't move or speak. She just pointed at one of the washing machines. When I looked inside, I saw myself, my reflection, but it wasn't moving like I was. It stared back at me with that same eerie grin, and its hand reached out of the glass. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding, but when I sat up in bed, I realized something was wrong. The faint humming was back, but it wasn't coming from outside or another apartment. It was coming from my closet. I sat there frozen, my breath caught in my throat. The humming was unmistakable now, steady, mechanical, relentless. My bedroom closet, which had always seemed so ordinary, suddenly felt like the mouth of some dark, yawning void. I didn't want to move, didn't want to even breathe, but my eyes were locked on the door. It wasn't closed all the way. The tiniest sliver of blackness peeked out, like the closet itself was watching me. My heart pounded in my chest so hard it felt like it would break through my ribs. But the worst part wasn't the sound, or the creeping terror of the door. It was the smell. A faint, sickly sweet odor wafted into the room, like decaying flowers or moldy fabric. It was subtle at first, but as the humming grew louder, the smell became overwhelming. It felt thick, almost tangible, and I had to fight the urge to gag. I reached for my phone on the nightstand. My hand was shaking so badly I could barely keep a grip on it, but I managed to turn on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, landing squarely on the closet door. The humming stopped. Just like that, it was silent again. Too silent. No faint hum of the fridge in the kitchen, no sound of cars outside, just a suffocating, unnatural stillness. I kept the light trained on the closet, my pulse roaring in my ears. Then, the door creaked. It opened just an inch, but in the stillness, the sound felt deafening. My breath hitched, and every instinct screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. I just sat there, paralyzed, as the door slowly opened wider. And that's when I saw it. At first, it looked like a bundle of clothes piled in the corner of the closet. But then the pile shifted, and something pale emerged, a hand. It was impossibly long and thin, with fingers that curled like claws. The hand reached out, gripping the edge of the door, and pulled it open farther. My flashlight flickered. In the brief, stuttery light, I saw her. The woman, or whatever she was, crouched inside the closet, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. Her eyes were wide and unblinking, and her grin stretched so far across her face it looked like her skin might tear. She was wearing the same gray hoodie I'd thrown away, but it hung on her frame like it didn't quite fit, like her limbs were too long and her body wasn't shaped right. She crawled forward, her movements jerky and wrong, like a marionette controlled by invisible strings. I scrambled backward, falling off the bed and landing hard on the floor. The flashlight slipped from my hand and rolled away, casting erratic shadows across the room. "Why did you come back?" she whispered, her voice raspy and broken, like it hadn't been used in years. I didn't, I stammered, my voice barely above a whisper. She tilted her head again, her grin somehow growing wider. "But you brought me with you." I couldn't take it anymore. I bolted for the door, not daring to look back. I didn't stop running until I was outside, standing under the harsh glow of a streetlight. My hands were trembling so badly I couldn't unlock my car at first. When I finally got in, I floored it and didn't stop driving until I was halfway across town. I didn't go back to that apartment, ever. I called a movie company the next day and paid them extra to pack up my stuff without me. I didn't even want to step foot in there again. I moved to a new place on the other side of town, and for a while, things were normal. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear it, the faint hum of a washing machine somewhere in the distance. And when I do, I know she's not far. She's waiting, somewhere in the shadows, smiling that impossibly wide smile. I used to work the night shift at a gas station off a desolate highway. It was one of those places where the nearest town is miles away, and we'd barely get a customer between 1 and 4 a.m. My manager loved to joke that this station was the last light before the abyss. After this encounter, I think he might have been right. It was a Wednesday. A little after 2 a.m. I was restocking the cold drink cooler when I heard the automatic door slide open. I peeked through the shelves, expecting to see a trucker or maybe some tired traveler, but the person standing there gave me pause. She was barefoot, wearing a white dress that looked more like a nightgown, stained with dirt at the hem. Her hair was matted, and her eyes were wide, darting around like she was trying to remember where she was. She didn't look drunk or high, just lost it. "Hi there," I said, stepping out from behind the counter. "Do you need help?" She didn't answer. Instead, she walked straight to the snack aisle, her bare feet making almost no sound on the linoleum. She picked up a bag of chips, stared at it for a moment, then set it down and moved to the next shelf. I tried asking again, "Ma'am, are you okay?" That's when she turned to me. Her eyes locked onto mine, and I swear I felt my stomach drop. She didn't blink. "That was..." Then she said, in this flat, almost robotic tone, "They're coming. They're almost here." "Who's coming?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. I'd dealt with weirdos before, but this felt different. "Grog." She didn't answer. Instead, she tilted her head like she was listening for something. Then she smiled, this slow, unsettling smile that didn't reach her eyes, and said, "You should leave." No. I was about to call the police when the lights in the station flickered. For a split second, everything went pitch black. When the lights came back on, she was gone. The doors hadn't opened, and I hadn't heard her leave, but she was nowhere to be found. I ran outside, scanning the parking lot and the highway, but it was empty. No cars, no footprints, nothing. I went back inside and locked the doors. My heart was racing, but I told myself it was just some drifter messing with me. Then I heard it, a faint tapping sound, coming from the cooler I'd been restocking earlier. I froze. The tapping got louder, more insistent, like someone was knocking from the inside. Slowly, I walked over, my hands trembling as I opened the cooler door. Nothing, just rows of soda bottles and energy drinks. I let out a shaky laugh, thinking I must be imagining things. And then, as I closed the door, I saw her reflection in the glass behind me, standing right there. I drove home that night faster than I probably should have. Every time I glanced in the rearview mirror, I half expected to see her sitting in the backseat, still smiling at me with those unnerving, unblinking eyes. But the car was empty, and I made it home without incident. I barely slept. Every creak in my house, every shadow cast by the street lights outside made my heart race. I couldn't shake the feeling that she was somehow still with me. But when morning came and the sunlight poured through my windows, I started to feel ridiculous. Maybe I'd been overtired. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe my mind had just played tricks on me. The next day, I told my manager what happened. He chuckled, then said something that chilled me. "Oh yeah, the barefoot girl. She's been around here before." "What?" I asked, my stomach twisting. "Yeah, some of the other night guys have mentioned her. She shows up, acts weird, then vanishes. People say this stretch of highway's haunted, you know, lots of stories, accidents, disappearances, that kind of thing. Maybe she's one of them." I wanted to laugh it off, but his tone wasn't joking. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" He shrugged. "Didn't think it'd matter. She hasn't hurt anyone, right?" I didn't say anything. I couldn't stop thinking about her reflection in the glass, that smile that didn't seem remotely human. A week went by, and I avoided night shifts entirely. I even started carrying a flashlight and pepper spray, just in case. But I couldn't escape the feeling that something had followed me. At home, I'd catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye. My dog, normally fearless, started whining at nothing, staring at the dark corners of the room with her tail tucked between her legs. Then, a few nights later, it happened again. I was sitting in my living room, trying to distract myself with TV, when the power flickered. Just like at the gas station, the lights cut out completely for a few seconds. When they came back on, my dog was gone. Her leash was still hanging by the door, and there was no way she could have gotten out. I locked everything. I called called her name, searched the entire house, even checked outside, but she was nowhere to be found. That's when I noticed the footprints. They were small, bare, and muddy, leading from my front door to the hallway. My stomach churned as I followed them, each step feeling heavier than the last. The trail led to my bedroom, where the door was ajar. I pushed it open slowly, my heart pounding so loud I could hear it in my ears. She was standing in the corner, her back to me. Her white dress was even dirtier than before, and her hair hung in tangled clumps. My dog was lying at her feet, completely still. "Ted," I shouted, my voice cracking. "Get out of my house." She didn't move. I stepped closer, my hand on the pepper spray, and repeated, "Get out, or I'll call the police." That's when she turned around, and I saw her face. It wasn't the same as before. Her eyes were pitch black, her skin pale and stretched tight over her skull. Her smile had grown impossibly wide, and her teeth were, too many of them, sharp and jagged, like a shark's. "You didn't leave," she whispered, her voice echoing in a way that shouldn't have been possible in such a small room. "You should have left." The lights flickered again, and when they came back on, she and my dog were gone. The only thing left was the muddy footprints, which now led back to the front door and out into the night. I haven't seen her since, but I've moved 3 times in the last year just to be safe. Months passed, but the unease never went away. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I thought I was safe, something small would happen to remind me she, or whatever she was, wasn't done with me yet. It whispered when I was alone, flickering lights, footsteps echoing where there shouldn't be any. And then, last week, I found the note. It was taped to the windshield of my car when I left work. It was just a scrap of lined paper, but the handwriting was eerily neat, each letter precise and deliberate. It read, "You moved, but you didn't leave. They're closer now." I don't know what she meant by they, and I don't want to find out. My first instinct was to throw the note away, but something stopped me. I couldn't explain it, but it felt like a warning, like ignoring it would only make things worse. That night, I barely slept. Every creak and groan of the house felt magnified, like something was moving just out of sight. When I finally drifted off, I dreamed of her. She was standing at the foot of my bed, her face blank and emotionless, except for that awful smile. "They're coming," she said again, but this time, she added something else, "and you brought them." I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart racing. The dream had felt so real, but it was just a dream, wasn't it? The next morning, I noticed something odd. The neighbor's dog, who usually barked at anything that moved, was silent. When I went outside, I saw the reason why. His chain was still attached to the post in the yard, but he was gone. The metal clasp looked like it had been snapped clean in half, as if something had yanked it apart with a human strength. That's when I knew I couldn't stay here anymore. I packed a bag and drove as far as I could to a small motel off a different highway. It felt like deja vu, another desolate place, another faint flicker of hope that I could outrun whatever was happening to me. The first night at the motel was quiet, and I started to think maybe I made the right call. But on the second night, I heard it again. The tapping. It started on the motel room window, faint at first, then louder, more insistent. I pulled back the curtain, but there was nothing there, just the empty parking lot, lit by a flickering neon sign. I told myself it was the wind, even as I heard it again, this time on the bathroom door. I didn't want to look. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to run, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. Slowly, I turned toward the sound, and that's when I saw it. The bathroom door was open just a crack, and in the sliver of darkness beyond, I saw her eyes, black, empty, and staring straight at me. "You should have left," she whispered. The lights in the room went out. I stumbled backward, fumbling for the door, but before I could reach it, I felt something grab my wrist. Cold, clammy, impossibly strong. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. When the lights flickered back on, she was gone. But I wasn't alone. The room was filled with shadows, shapes that didn't belong to anything I could see. They moved, shifting and twisting, as if they were alive. And then, one by one, they started to take form. Faces, limbs, mouths filled with teeth. They didn't move like people. They didn't move like anything I've ever seen. I don't remember how I got out. The next thing I knew, I was in my car, driving as fast as I could. I didn't stop until the sun came up, and even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still following me. Now, I'm writing this from another motel somewhere even farther away, but I know it's only a matter of time. The shadows, the voices, they're not just following me, they're getting closer. If you've read this far, do me a favor, don't ignore the warnings. Don't wait for the lights to flicker or the tapping to start. If you ever see her, the barefoot girl in the white dress, just leave. Don't ask questions, don't look back, just go. Because once she finds you, she's not the only one you have to worry about. This happened a few years ago, and I still get chills thinking about it. I used to work late shifts at a small diner just outside of town. My car was in the shop for what felt like forever, so I relied on the city bus to get home. Most nights, the bus was nearly empty. Just me, a few other exhausted workers, and maybe the occasional late night wanderer. One Friday, my shift ended later than usual because we had a surprise inspection. By the time I made it to the bus stop, it was close to midnight. The stop was on a quiet street with just one flickering street light. It was a crisp, clear night, and the street was eerily empty. As I waited, I noticed a figure standing a bit further down the sidewalk, leaning against a telephone pole. They were partially hidden in the shadows, but I could tell they were watching me. I tried to ignore them, assuming it was just another night owl waiting for the bus. A few minutes passed, and I started to feel uneasy. The figure hadn't moved at all, not even shifting their weight or turning their head, just standing there, perfectly still like a statue. Then I heard it, a low, humming noise, like someone softly singing or mumbling, but it didn't sound. It was off-key, like a broken lullaby mixed with static. I glanced over, and the figure was still in the same spot, but now it seemed closer. Not by much, maybe a step or two, but I hadn't seen them move. I decided to check my phone, partly to distract myself and partly to avoid looking at them. No messages, no new notifications, just the glowing screen reflecting my anxious face. The humming grew louder. I dared another glance, and my stomach dropped. The figure was now directly under the flickering streetlight, still as a statue, but I could finally make out some details. Their clothes were tattered, like they'd been dragged through mud and gravel, and their face. I still can't explain it. It wasn't that it was grotesque or deformed, it was just wrong. Their features didn't sit right, like they were slightly too close together or maybe stretched in the wrong places. And their eyes, they weren't glowing, but they had this sheen to them, like oil slicks catching the light. I froze. The humming stopped, and then they smiled. Not a warm, friendly smile. It was too wide, stretching their face in an unnatural way. It felt like they were mocking me, playing with my fear. I stood up and backed away, ready to bolt down the street, but be damned. But as I did, the figure tilted their head like a curious dog and took one deliberate step forward. I didn't wait to see what they'd do next. I turned and sprinted down the street as fast as I could. My heart was pounding, and I didn't dare look back. When I reached the next major intersection, I finally spotted the bus pulling up to the curb. I waved frantically and jumped on. As the doors closed, I risked a glance out the window. The street was empty. For weeks after that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I was just paranoid after the encounter, or perhaps I had misunderstood what I'd seen. But the feeling persisted, especially when I was alone. It wasn't just a general unease either, it was specific. I felt it most strongly when I was near windows or walking down long, empty streets. It felt like a pair of unseen eyes boring into my back, always out of sight but never far away. One night, a few weeks after the bus stop incident, I was home alone. My roommate was out of town visiting family, and I decided to have a quiet night in. I tried to keep myself busy, watching TV, scrolling through my phone, anything to keep my mind from wandering. It was around 11:30 p.m. when I heard it again, the humming. At first, I thought it was my imagination. Maybe a song on TV had a similar tone, or maybe I was just projecting my fear. But no, when I muted the TV, the sound was still there. It was faint, like it was coming from somewhere outside. My heart started racing. I told myself not to panic, not to overreact. It was probably just a neighbor or someone passing by on the street. I got up and walked cautiously to the front window, peeking through the blinds. The street outside was empty. The humming grew louder. It wasn't coming from the street. It was coming from the backyard. I froze, my mind racing. My house backed up to a wooded area, and while it wasn't unusual for animals to wander close, this was no animal. The humming was rhythmic, deliberate, and unmistakably human. I crept to the back door, my hands trembling as I flipped the lock and pulled the curtain aside just enough to see outside. The backyard was bathed in pale moonlight, and at first, I didn't see anything. But then, just at the edge of the tree line, I saw a figure. It was the same one from the bus stop. They were standing perfectly still, just like before, staring directly at the house. Even from that distance, I could see their twisted smile, their unnerving eyes glinting in the moonlight. The humming stopped, and then they moved, not towards the house, not away from it. They started pacing back and forth along the tree line, their movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on tangled strings. I panicked. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, whispering frantically to the operator about someone in my yard. They assured me an officer would be dispatched and told me to stay on the line. As I waited, I kept my eyes on the figure. They didn't come any closer, but their pacing grew faster, more erratic, like they were agitated. The smile never left their face. It felt like an eternity before I saw the flashing lights of the police car. The figure stopped pacing and turned, disappearing into the woods in an instant, like they'd been waiting for their cue to leave. The officers searched the area but found no trace of anyone. No footprints, no signs of disturbance, nothing. They assured me it was probably just a prank or a drifter passing through, but their dismissive tone didn't ease my fear. That night, I didn't sleep. In the weeks that followed, the humming came back a few more times. Always faint, always distant, but enough to keep me on edge. I moved out of that house not long after, and I haven't heard it since. A few years passed, and while I moved to a different city and done my best to move on, the memory of the humming and that twisted smile never fully left me. Every so often, I think I caught a glimpse of someone out of the corner of my eye, a figure too still, too unnatural. But when I turned to look, there was never anyone there. I started to wonder if it had all been in my head. Maybe I built it up in my mind, exaggerating the details over time. Therapy helped me process some of the fear, and I began to convince myself that whatever I'd experienced was over. Until last month, it was a Saturday night, and I was out with some friends at a bar downtown. It had been a good night, lots of laughter, good drinks, and the kind of carefree energy I hadn't felt in years. By the time I decided to head home, it was late, but I wasn't worried. The streets downtown were well lit, and the rideshare app showed my driver was only a few minutes away. As I stood on the curb waiting, I noticed a street performer a little ways down. They were dressed in a tattered, mismatched outfit, and their head was bowed as they swayed back and forth to some strange, halting melody. At first, I didn't think much of it, just another eccentric artist trying to catch the late night crowd. But then, I realized the melody sounded familiar. It was humming. My stomach dropped. I told myself it was just a coincidence, a random tune that happened to resemble the one from my nightmare. But as I watched, the performer's movements grew more erratic, their swaying turning into jerky, puppet-like motions. And then they stopped. Slowly, they lifted their head, and my heart nearly stopped. It was them, the same unsettling smile, the same two wide eyes, the same air of wrongness that made every instinct in my body scream to run. I stumbled backward, my pulse pounding in my ears. I fumbled for my phone, trying to cancel the rideshare and call for help, but my hands were shaking so badly that I dropped it on the pavement. When I looked up, they were closer. I didn't see them move. I never do, but they were now standing at the edge of the light from the street lamp, their face partially obscured by shadow. "I've missed you," they said, their voice a raspy whisper that somehow carried through the night air. I don't remember much after that. I must have grabbed my phone and run, because the next thing I knew, I was in my apartment, every door locked and bolted, sitting on the floor with my back against the wall. I didn't sleep that night, or the night after. Now, every time I step outside, I feel like they're watching me. I don't know how they found me, or what they want, but I know this isn't over. If you're reading this and you ever hear that humming, please don't ignore it. Don't look for the source. Don't try to convince yourself it's nothing, because once they find you, they don't let go. This happened to me about 5 years ago, and to this day, I'm not sure if I imagined it or if it was something worse. I live in a mid-sized city with an old, labyrinthine subway system. It's not like the sleek, modern ones you see in movies. Our trains are relics, noisy and dimly lit, clattering down tunnels that smell of damp concrete and burnt metal. I worked late shifts back then, so catching the last train was a regular thing for me. One night, I missed the second to last train because of a sudden downpour. I ducked into a convenience store, waiting for the rain to let up, and by the time I got to the station, the place was nearly empty. It was a little unsettling to see the platform so quiet. The usual hum of people and announcements had been replaced by a hollow, echoing silence. When the train finally arrived, I stepped on and realized I was the only passenger in the car. That wasn't uncommon for the last train of the night, so I settled into my usual spot near the middle of the car and pulled out my phone. The train started moving, the wheels screeching against the tracks, and I busied myself scrolling through Instagram. I don't know how long it was before I noticed something wasn't right. The lights in the car began to flicker, not the occasional buzz and blink, but a rhythmic stuttering that made it hard to focus. Then I realized the train wasn't stopping. It should have hit 3 stations by now, but it just kept barreling forward, the darkness of the tunnel stretching endlessly on both sides. I glanced up from my phone and froze. Across the car, a man was sitting in the seat directly facing mine. Here's the thing, I know he wasn't there when I boarded. I had checked, almost instinctively, because late night rides can attract some sketchy people, but there he was now, sitting perfectly still, staring straight at me. He was rugged. His clothes were outdated, like something from the 1940s, a gray suit and a wide-brimmed hat. His skin was pale and waxy, and his eyes were so sunken they looked more like shadows than anything else. What stood out the most, though, was how impossibly still he was. Not even the slight sway of the train seemed to affect him. I tried to act normal, glancing away and pretending to fiddle with my phone, but I couldn't help stealing quick looks at him. Each time, he was a little closer. First, he was at the far end of the car, then halfway down, then in the seat across the aisle from me. I didn't see him move. He was just there. At this point, my heart was pounding and my mind was racing with excuses. Maybe he was some sort of performer trying to mess with me. Maybe I was just tired. tired, and my eyes were playing tricks on me. I wanted to get up and move to another car, but something about him felt paralyzing, like if I stood up, I'd break some unspoken rule and things would get worse. Then he smiled. It wasn't a human smile. His lips stretched far too wide, his teeth unnaturally small and sharp, like needles crammed into a too big mouth. He tilted his head, as if studying me, and I swear I heard a low chuckle, though his mouth never moved after that smile. The train jolted, and I broke out of my frozen state. I stood up and ran for the door to the next car. It was locked. I started banging on it, yelling, hoping anyone was in there and could hear me. When I turned back, the man was gone, but his hat was lying on the seat where I'd been sitting. I didn't think. I just kept banging until I felt the train slowing down. It finally stopped, the doors opened, and I sprinted out onto an unfamiliar platform. It was completely deserted, no signs, no maps, just a single flight of stairs leading up to a black iron gate. I turned to look back at the train, and the man was standing in the window, still smiling that awful smile. As the train pulled away, the lights in the car flickered one last time, and I swear I saw other faces behind him. Pressed against the glass, I climbed the stairs and found myself in an alley I didn't recognize, but I kept running until I found a street with people. I eventually called a cab to take me home, but I never figured out where I was or how I got there. For years, I avoided the subway entirely. I'd take buses, walk miles, even call out sick if I couldn't find another way. Something about that night had latched onto me, gnawing at the edges of my mind whenever I let myself think about it for too long. I tried to tell myself it was a nightmare, maybe a stress-induced hallucination, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Then, a few weeks ago, I got stuck in traffic during a torrential rainstorm. I was late for a meeting and, against my better judgment, I decided to take the subway. I told myself it had been years, that nothing weird would happen, and that my fear was irrational. The station looked the same, but I felt different. Older, sure, but also Laura. I scanned every face, every shadow, my ears tuned for even the slightest sound. Nothing seemed out of place. When the train arrived, it was packed with commuters, and I felt a surge of relief. I stepped on, wedging myself between a guy in a business suit and a teenager with headphones, and held onto the pole. For most of the ride, everything was normal. The usual hum of conversation, the occasional buzz of a phone, the rhythmic screech of the wheels. It was almost comforting. But as we approached my stop, something caught my eye. A reflection. I was standing near the window, and for a split second, I thought I saw a familiar face in the glass, pale skin, sunken eyes, that too wide smile. I whipped my head around, but there was no one there, just a woman in a scarf scrolling through her phone. The doors opened at my stop, and I hurried off the train, telling myself it was just my imagination. I made my way up the stairs and out into the rainy evening, trying to shake the unease that had settled in my chest. That's when I noticed the hat. It was sitting on the curb just outside the station entrance, soaked from the rain but unmistakable. The same gray, wide-brimmed hat he had been wearing all those years ago. I froze, staring at it, as a sense of dread washed over me. And then, in the corner of my eye, I saw movement. Across the street, half hidden in the shadows of an alley, was a figure. He was too far away to make out clearly, but I knew it was him. The same suit, the same stillness, and even though I couldn't see his face, I knew he was smiling. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I bolted, running down the street, my shoes splashing through puddles as I tried to put as much distance between myself and that alley as possible. I didn't stop until I reached my apartment, locking the door behind me, collapsing onto the floor. For the past few nights, I've been hearing noises outside my window, a faint chuckle, like someone is standing just out of sight. Sometimes, I'll find wet footprints on the stairs leading up to my door, even though it hasn't rained since that night. I've been trying to convince myself I was imagining things. Maybe the hat had been a coincidence, or maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But last night made it impossible to deny anymore. He's real, and he's getting closer. It started around 1 a.m. I was in bed, scrolling through my phone, trying to tire myself out. The room was silent, save for the occasional creak of the old pipes in my building. Then I heard it, the faint sound of something tapping against my window. I live on the 3rd floor. There's no fire escape, no trees close enough to reach the window, nothing that could explain the noise. My stomach dropped, but I forced myself to look. The blinds were closed, and for a long moment, I just stared at them, praying the sound would stop. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't frantic or loud, just a soft, deliberate rhythm, like someone was testing the glass. I finally mustered the courage to inch out of bed and peek through the blinds. The street below was empty. No cars, no people, just the dim orange glow of the streetlights reflecting off the wet pavement. I stared out for what felt like forever, trying to spot anything anything unusual. Then I realized the tapping hadn't stopped. It was coming from the inside. I spun around, hard hammering, and there he was, standing in the corner of my room, barely visible in the shadows. The same gray suit, the same sunken eyes, the same unnaturally wide grin. He didn't move, didn't make a sound, but the air in the room seemed to shift, heavy and suffocating. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the edge of the bed, and reached for the lamp on my nightstand. The second I turned it on, he was gone. The corner was empty, like he'd never been there at all. But something was different. The hat, the same hat I'd seen on the curb outside the station, was now lying on my dresser. It was dry, and possibly so, and placed neatly as if it belonged there. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat in the living room with every light in the apartment turned on, clutching a kitchen knife like it would actually help me. But he didn't come back, at least, not that I saw. This morning, I tried to throw the hat away. I stuffed it into a trash bag, tied it up, and carried it to the dumpster behind my building. For a brief moment, I felt a flicker of relief, like I'd finally taken control. But when I got back to my apartment, it was waiting for me on the kitchen table. I don't know what he wants, and I don't know how to make it stop. I've thought about running, packing a bag, and leaving the city entirely, but something tells me it won't matter. He found me once after years of silence. He'll find me again. This happened about 6 months ago, but it still sends chills down my spine when I think about it. I work as a delivery driver for a small courier company. The hours are long, but the pay is decent, and I like the solitude of being on the road. That night, I was assigned a late run delivery to package to a remote farm about 30 miles outside of town. The route took me down one of those endless 2-lane highways, pitch black except for the dim glow of my headlights. About halfway there, I noticed something strange in my rearview mirror. The pair of headlights appeared out of nowhere, way too close for comfort. It startled me because I hadn't seen another car for miles. The lights were bright, almost blinding, and whoever it was seemed to be tailgating me. I thought about pulling over to let them pass, but every time I slowed down, the car behind me slowed too. If I sped up, they stayed right on my bumper. It felt like a game of chicken, except I was the only one getting scared. After what felt like forever, I finally reached a stretch of road where there was a small turnoff. I took it, hoping the car would keep going, but as soon as I stopped, so did they. I couldn't see much through their headlights, but I could just make out the shape of a large black car. It wasn't moving, but I could feel the weight of someone or something watching me. I rolled down my window slightly to call out, "Hey, do you need something?" My voice sounded steadier than I felt. No response. The car just sat there, idling, the silence pressed down on me, broken only by the low hum of my engine and the distant rustling of the wind. Suddenly, their headlights cut out. I froze. Now I could see the silhouette of the car more clearly, and something wasn't right about it. It looked old, like one of those 1950s Cadillacs, but the edges were wrong, too jagged, too angular, almost like it was pieced together from scraps. Then I noticed movement. A figure stepped out of the driver's side. They were tall, unnaturally so, and their gait was stiff, like a puppet on strings. They didn't have a flashlight or a phone, just this lurching, slow walk toward my truck. I panicked. I threw the truck into reverse and gunned it back onto the highway. As I sped away, I looked back and saw the figure standing in the middle of the road, watching me. Their face ... or what I think was their face ... did and look human. It was pale and featureless, almost like a mannequin. I didn't stop again until I reached the farm. When I got there, I was so shaken that the guy I delivered to asked if I was okay. I tried to explain, but I don't think he believed me. Here's the part that really freaks me out. On the way back, I took a different route to avoid the highway. When I got home, I checked the dash cam footage from my truck. The headlights in the car were there ... but the figure wasn't. After that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was ... off. The encounter replayed in my mind over and over. The strange car, the mannequin-like figure, and the bizarre absence of it in the dashcam footage. It felt like a fever dream, too vivid to dismiss but too surreal to be real. I mentioned it to a co-worker, Steve, who's been with the company for years. I thought maybe he'd brush it off, but his face went pale. "What kind of car did you say it was?" he asked, voice tight. "An old Cadillac," I said. It looked patched together, almost like a junkyard Frankenstein. Steve didn't say anything for a long time, just stared at the table like he was deciding whether to speak. Finally, he leaned in and whispered, "You're not the first to see it." That got my attention. "What do you mean?" And Steve explained that over the years, a few drivers have reported seeing a similar car on that highway, always late at night, always following too closely. Some claimed it disappeared as soon as they tried to confront it. Others said they saw the driver, but the descriptions were inconsistent. Some said it was a man in a wide-brimmed hat. Others swore it was a woman with wild hair. One guy even quit after claiming the car forced him off the road, only to vanish when help arrived. Urban legend stuff, Steve said, shrugging. But you look spooked, so maybe it's more than that. That conversation stuck with me, but I didn't want to obsess over it. I told myself it was probably some weirdo playing pranks, or maybe I'd just been overworked and imagined things. Then, about a week later, I found something strange. I was cleaning out my truck after another late shift when I noticed a smear of something dark on the rear bumper. At first, I thought it was dirt or oil, but when I wiped it with a rag, it came off in long, sticky strands. It was black, but not like oil. It had an iridescent sheen, almost like the surface of a bubble, and it stank. The smell was sharp and chemical, like burnt plastic mixed with decay. I had no idea what it was, but it made my stomach churn. I took a photo of it and sent it to Steve, joking that maybe it was a gift from the creepy car. He didn't find it funny. He texted back immediately, "Throw that rag away and clean your truck." Now, his urgency freaked me out, so I followed his advice. I scrubbed every inch of the truck and tossed the rag in the dumpster behind our depot, but the smell lingered, faint but persistent, like it had seeped into the metal. That night, I had my first nightmare. In it, I was driving down the same highway, except this time, my truck wouldn't move. No matter how hard I pressed the gas, I stayed frozen while the car crept closer and closer in my rearview mirror. The figure got out again, but this time, it wasn't faceless. It had my face, distorted and stretched into a grotesque mockery of a smile. I woke up gasping, drenched in sweat. The nightmares didn't stop. Over the next few weeks, they got worse. Sometimes the figure would bang on my windows, its hands leaving behind those same black, iridescent smears. Other times, I'd wake up feeling like I couldn't breathe, the smell of burnt plastic choking me. I started dreading sleep, dreading work, dreading the highway. Last week, I found another smear on the truck, this time on the windshield. I know for a fact he wasn't there when I parked. The security footage from the depot showed nothing unusual, just my truck sitting in the lot all night. But when I played it back, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. At exactly 3:33 a.m., the camera glitched. Just for a second, and when the feed came back, the smear was there. I don't know what's happening, but I've started avoiding night shifts. Steve says he knows someone who can bless the truck, but I don't know if I believe in that kind of thing. All I know is that whatever followed me that night hasn't let go. Things only got worse after that. Despite my best efforts to avoid night shifts, I got called in last Friday to cover for someone. I didn't want to go, but I needed the money. It was supposed to be an easy route, a quick delivery to a warehouse just outside town. I told myself it was fine. I wouldn't take the highway. I wouldn't stay out late. I'd just get it done and get back home. The first half of the night went smoothly. The roads were quiet, the delivery was quick, and I was back in the truck by 9 p.m. I took a side road home, avoiding the highway like I planned. For a while, everything seemed normal, until it wasn't. I noticed the smell first. That awful, burnt plastic stench wafted into the cab, faint but unmistakable. My stomach dropped. I glanced at the dashboard, half expecting some kind of engine issue, but everything was fine. That's when I saw it. In the side mirror, far in the distance, a pair of headlights appeared. My pulse quickened. I told myself it was just another car, nothing to worry about. But as I kept driving, the lights got closer, too close. I tried not to panic, keeping my speed steady, but no matter how fast or slow I went, the car stayed on me like a shadow. Then the headlights flickered, just for a second, and I knew it was the same car. The black, jagged shape, the unnatural way it moved, the way the lights didn't reflect properly off the road, like they were coming from another time or place. I felt trapped, like the walls of the truck were closing in on me. This time, I didn't stop. I kept driving, taking turn after turn, hoping to lose it. But no matter where I went, it followed. I tried calling Steve, but my phone wouldn't work. Every time I dialed, I got static, and then faint whispers like someone was breathing on the line. Finally, I made it to a small gas station. The lights were on, and there were a few cars parked out front. I pulled in, heart pounding, and threw the truck into park. The black car didn't follow me in. It stopped just short of the entrance. I leaned on the edge of the road, its headlights still glaring. I ran inside, desperate to tell someone what was happening. The clerk, a tired-looking guy in his 50-seconds, raised an eyebrow as I stumbled to the counter. "You okay, man?" "There's a car," I stammered. "It's been following me. It's right outside." He looked past me, out the window, then back at me. "I don't see anything." I turned to look, and sure enough, the road was empty. The black car was gone. My stomach sank. "You sure you're okay?" the clerk asked, his tone softer now, like he thought I was losing it. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak, and bought a bottle of water to calm my nerves. When I got back to the truck, I hesitated before getting in. I didn't see any black smears this time, but the smell was stronger than ever. It clung to the air, thick and suffocating. I drove home in silence, gripping the wheels so hard my knuckles turned white. Every shadow on the road felt like it was watching me. Every flicker of light made my heart race. By the time I got home, I was shaking. When I stepped out of the truck, I noticed something new. On the ground, just behind the rear tires, was a trail of that same black, iridescent substance. It stretched down the driveway and into the street, like something had been dragging itself along behind me. I don't know what to do anymore. Steve thinks I should quit, but part of me feels like this thing won't stop just because I leave the job. I don't even know if it's real or if I'm losing my mind. All I know is that it's getting closer. The dreams, the smells, the smears, they're not going away. I haven't been back on the highway since, and I'm starting to think I never will. Creepy car, or whatever you are, stay away from me. A few weeks ago, my best friend, Mia, and I decided to go for a late night swim at our local community pool. It was a 24-hour facility, and we'd gone a handful of times before when the world was asleep and the water was calm. There was something serene about the silence of an empty pool, just the two of us floating under dim, buzzing lights. This time, though, I wish we'd never gone. It was just after 11 p.m. when we arrived. The parking lot was empty except for an old sedan parked in a corner, its windows fogged up. I remember joking that it looked like someone was living in it, but Mia brushed it off. Probably just a staff member, she said. Inside, the air smelled like chlorine and damp concrete. The receptionist's desk was unmanned, as usual at that hour. We signed ourselves in on the clipboard and walked to the pool. The water was still, reflecting the ceiling lights like a giant, liquid mirror. We swam for about half an hour, taking turns racing each other or floating on our backs. Eventually, Mia suggested we practice holding our breath underwater. She went first, diving to the bottom and staying down for what felt like forever. When she resurfaced, her face was pale. "Did you see that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "See what?" I asked, immediately feeling a knot tighten in my stomach. "Someone or something was at the bottom of the pool." I laughed nervously, thinking she was joking, but her expression was dead serious. "It's probably just a shadow or your reflection," I said, but when it was my turn to dive, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I took a deep breath and dove. The water was cold and silent. I swam to the bottom, and just as I turned to head back up, I saw it. A figure was crouched in the corner of the deep end. It wasn't swimming or floating. It was sitting there, motionless, with its arms wrapped around its knees. I panicked and shot to the surface, gasping for air. "There's someone down there," I hissed, looking around wildly. The pool area was still empty except for us, but I felt eyes on me. The kind of feeling where your skin prickles and your instincts scream at you to run. Bea wanted to leave immediately, but I convinced her to stay. I told myself it had to be a trick of the light or maybe something left on the pool floor. But deep down, I knew better. We decided to stick to the shallow end, trying to laugh off the unease. I kept glancing toward the deep end, half expecting the figure to surface. That's when the lights flickered, just a quick buzz and dim, but it was enough to send chills down my spine. Then we heard it, a faint, muffled splash. Both of us froze, staring at the far end of the pool. The water was rippling, small waves reaching toward us, but there was no one there. "Nope, I'm done," Mia said, climbing out. I wasn't far behind her. We grabbed our towels and practically ran to the locker room. I turned back once, just before we rounded the corner. The ripples had stopped, and the pool was still again, but I swear I saw something bobbing just beneath the surface. In the locker room, we hurried to change, barely speaking. Just as I was pulling on my hoodie, I heard it again, a faint splash, followed by slow, deliberate footsteps. White footsteps. I looked at Mia, who was frozen, her eyes wide with fear. The footsteps grew louder, echoing through the tiled room. They stopped just outside our stall. We didn't dare breathe. The door creaked slightly, and through the gap, I saw a bare, wet foot, pale as death, standing inches from the door. We bolted, not bothering to finish dressing. As we ran out, I glanced toward the pool one last time. The water was completely still, but the figure was standing at the edge now, watching us leave. We haven't been back to that pool since. For days after that night, I couldn't shake the image of the figure at the pool's edge. Its unnaturally pale skin, the way it seemed to shimmer under the dim lights, and the fact that it didn't chase us, all of it haunted my thoughts. Leah refused to talk about it. Anytime I brought it up, she'd quickly change the subject or insist she didn't see anything. One night, about a week later, I woke up to a strange dream. I was underwater, struggling to reach the surface, but something was holding my ankle. When I looked down, I saw the same pale figure from the pool. Its face was featureless, just smooth, white flesh, and yet I could feel it staring at me. Its grip tightened as I fought to break free, and just as I thought my lungs would give out, I woke up gasping for air. I tried to convince myself it was just a dream, but deep down, I felt it was more than that. I started avoiding water altogether, no showers, just quick rinses, and I couldn't even bring myself to fill a sink without feeling a sense of dread. Then, Mia called me late one night. She sounded frantic. "It's here," she whispered. What's there?" I asked, my heart pounding. "I don't know, but I can hear it," she said. "There's water on my floor, like someone walked through here soaking wet. I keep hearing splashing. It's like it's following me." I tried to calm her down, but before I could say much, she screamed. The call ended abruptly. I drove to her house as fast as I could. When I got there, her front door was slightly open and the lights inside flickered. The house was eerily quiet except for a faint dripping sound. "Leah," I called out, stepping inside. My voice echoed. I followed the sound of the dripping to the bathroom. The floor was wet, and the faucet was running, though no one was there. My stomach dropped when I noticed something, wet footprints leading from the bathroom to her bedroom. I hesitated but forced myself to follow the trail. The door to her room was ajar. I pushed it open slowly, calling her name again. The room was empty, but the window was open, curtains billowing in the breeze. The footprints stopped at the window. I leaned out, looking into the yard below, but there was nothing, just darkness. My phone buzzed in my pocket, startling me. It was a text from Mia's number. "Help me." I didn't know what to do. The police weren't going to believe a word of this, and I couldn't even begin to explain what was happening. I searched the house top to bottom, but Mia was gone. The last thing I found chilled me to my core. On her kitchen counter was a damp, folded piece of paper. When I opened it, there was only one thing written in shaky, water-streaked handwriting. "Don't go back to the pool." The weeks following Mia's disappearance blurred together. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, and the sound of water, any water, filled me with a bone-deep terror. The police came to question me several times, but there was little I could say without sounding insane. We went swimming, and then she disappeared was the most I could manage. Then came the dreams. They started as shadows in water, vague and distant. Over time, they became more vivid. I would be back at the pool, the water impossibly dark and deep, pulling me down. That figure, pale, featureless, would be waiting, its arms outstretched, its presence suffocating. One night, I woke up choking on the taste of chlorine. I tried everything to move on. Therapy, meditation, even a brief attempt to research the history of the pool. But there was nothing unusual about it. No urban legends, no mysterious drownings, no logical explanation for what we saw. Just a regular community pool with a long history of chlorine treatments and kids' swim lessons. Then, 3 weeks after Mia vanished, I found something on my doorstep. A water-damaged envelope, warped and streaked, as if it had been left out in the rain. Inside was a photograph. It was a picture of the pool, taken from the deep end. The surface of the water was still, but in the bottom corner of the image, something was visible, something pale and humanoid, crouching just beneath the surface. There was no note, no explanation, and no sign of who had left it. That same night, I began hearing the splashes again. The first time I heard it, I thought it was in my head. A faint, rhythmic splash, like someone swimming in slow motion. I checked my faucets, my pipes, even my backyard, thinking it might be a leak. But everything was dry. The sound stopped as soon as I stopped searching, but it came back the next night. In the night after that. By the fourth night, the sound had grown louder, more distinct. It wasn't just splashing anymore. I could hear the faint echo of footsteps, wet and heavy, slapping against the ground. It was always distant, always just beyond where I could see, but it was getting closer. I started sleeping with the lights on, as if that would keep it at bay. One night, I woke up to find the lights flickering. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. It was another text from Mia's number. "It's her." I stared at the screen, my heart racing. The splashing grew louder, now accompanied by the unmistakable sound of dripping water. I forced myself to look toward the doorway of my bedroom. The floor was wet, water pooled in uneven streaks, leading toward my bed. I grabbed my phone and bolted, slipping on the slick floor as I ran for the front door. I didn't care that I was barefoot or that it was the middle of the night. I just needed to get out. I drove aimlessly for hours, not knowing where to go. The streets were deserted, the night eerily quiet except for the occasional sound of my tires on wet pavement. It wasn't raining, but the road glistened as if it had just been drenched. Eventually, I found myself pulling into the parking lot of the community pool. I don't know why. Maybe I thought I'd find answers. Maybe I thought I'd find Mia. The old sedan was still there, sitting in the same corner, windows fogged. My breath hitched as I realized I could see someone sitting in the driver's seat. They didn't move, didn't acknowledge me, just sat there, staring straight ahead. I turned away and walked toward the building. The door was unlocked, as it always was, and the reception desk was empty. I could hear the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead, the faint smell of chlorine hanging in the air. The pool was just as I remembered it, still, quiet. The water glistened under the dim lights, and for a moment, I thought I was alone. But then I saw it. The figure. It was in the deep end, floating just beneath the surface. Its head was tilted back, its body unnaturally stiff, its pale, featureless face staring up at the ceiling. My phone buzzed in my hand. A text from Mia's number. "Help me." Against every instinct, I stepped closer. The figure didn't move. The water around it was unnaturally calm, like it was frozen in place. "Leah," I whispered, my voice cracking. The figure's head snapped toward me. I stumbled back, slipping on the wet tiles, and hit the ground hard. When I looked up, the figure was gone. The water was rippling violently, and for a moment, I thought it had disappeared. But then I heard it, the sound of wet footsteps coming toward me. I don't remember much after that, just flashes, the feeling of cold, wet hands grabbing me, the sound of water filling my ears, and a voice, Mia's voice, whispering, "It's not done." When I woke up, I was lying lying on the floor of the pool area, drenched and lonely. My phone was gone, so was the figure. Alright, but that's it. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to subscribe to my channel, like this video, and comment something down below. But as always,
Have a nice day.